actually.
Speakers. I'll have about 40 speakers tonight.
How many?
I'm teasing.
40.
No, I'm kidding. We'll leave here about 1. just tell them to be done by 8:30 so we can watch the baseball game.
Okay, well, let's keep your 40 speakers at home.
I'm teasing you.
Yeah.
I don't, just me. Yeah, I'll check on.
Yeah.
Check on.
See how it's going. I'm doing well. What's that?
Making changes.
Got it.
Yeah. Thank you.
It is. It almost looks less here. But it is. Or the Cambridge.
All right, Mr. Best, let's get started.
Welcome to the October 3rd Arlington County Transportation Commission. Staff would like to introduce 2 new members. We have Davis Ratick and also Taylor Rich for their first meeting this evening.
Welcome.
Wait till you see what you're getting into.
As far as item 1 is citizen comment, and we have one speaker, Mr. Jerez.
So I read the draft report, the shared mobility devices demonstration project, and I was appalled. These devices should be banned. Tonight, this afternoon, saw a woman on an electric bicycle or on a stop sign in my community, Arlington. Didn't even slow down with a child on the back of the bicycle. I saw someone with another bicycle weaving at high speed down 10th Street while I was on my way here, ignored a traffic light, and I saw somebody in the plaza riding at high speed with a bicycle. I'm appalled by the way this county considers safety, multimodal safety, bicycles, skateboards, and scooters. These are inherently dangerous devices, inherently dangerous devices. The history of American mobility in the last half century is to make vehicles safer. Child seats, airbags, seat belts, mandatory. Okay? What are you doing here? You're making the environment for pedestrians hazardous. It's completely irresponsible. It goes against anything and everything that anyone in the realm of design, manufacturing, quality assurance, which is what I do for a living, has espoused all their careers. I mean, we get all upset about it at 737, you know? We ground them for safety. And then the people that fly them get on a bicycle and zoom around their neighborhood, okay? This is insane. This is insanity. This is irresponsible. The only person I have seen here and in the county board that is acting responsibly is Dr. Clement. And she was out there last night saying, no way, we should be allowing high-speed scooters and bicycles on trails, on sidewalks, anywhere. And she's right. You go against everything that the history of technology for the past 50 years. I mean, nobody is saying, okay, it's okay to smoke cigarettes here. There's not that much danger. Nobody's saying that. It's okay to carry handguns around. There's not that much danger. Nobody's getting shot on the street. People are getting hurt on the street by these bicycles, skateboards, and scooters. When will you come to your senses? This is insanity. Insanity. Thank you.
Our next item is item number 2. This is actually a certificate of appreciation for Naomi Messman. Obviously, she is not here this evening, so we will have to deliver this at a later date.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Best. I do want to just make sure everybody understands the commitment that Commissioner Messman made. She was a representative from Marymount University, here as a student commissioner, and sat through all of our very long meetings with a voice, but without a vote, which I think it really shows a dedication to her community. And so that is the reason for this certificate of appreciation, which we will make sure that she gets.
Great, thank you. Item 3 is the CIP project overview. This is an info item. Jason Winstrom is here this evening from DES Transportation to give you an overview.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. I'm excited to present some information for you tonight about the transportation CIP. My core area is considered the Complete Streets portfolio, which is somewhat different than some people may think about Complete Streets. We have other programs like the NC Neighborhood Conservation, the Neighborhood Complete Streets programs as well. The area I focus on is more on the arterial work, and so that's what I'm going to present tonight.
Can you just maybe tilt your mic up a little bit closer to your face? I think a much
Sure.
shorter person was there prior to you.
Is that better? All right. So as I just mentioned, I work in the complete streets area that's more related to arterials. And the goal of our program is to improve safety and access for all users, pedestrian, transit riders, bikers, motorists. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve, again, the safety, but we also look at street aesthetics and try to incorporate stormwater management in those as well. The way that we get to those goals is we typically do work that is sidewalk expansion, eliminating obstructions to get the clear width for ADA, reconfiguring curb ramps at intersections and bump outs, crosswalk enhancements, as well as improvements to the signal. We do some additional lighting where necessary. We provide bike lanes along the arterials. And we also look at trying to improve access to transit. So the MTP is the Master Transportation Plan is kind of our guidebook in terms of where we're looking to put projects. And really it is we look for the appropriate type of installation or improvement given the context of the street. So if it's a smaller, low volume road, that has a different kind of type of project or different scope than it would be if it were something like Columbia Pike. So we take a look at that, what we're trying to do in the overarching plan, and then implement. So I figured tonight what would be useful, since I'm giving a brief overview, is to go through the major program areas that I work with, and then maybe talk a little bit about the funding that we use for those projects. So I gave two handouts, and the first of which is just the 8.5 by 11 that kind of covers the program areas. So I really focused on the larger ones. The other handout I gave on the tabloid-sized piece of paper lists some of the other areas. We do put specific projects, if they're large enough, as individual program areas or projects, which is probably similar to other areas of the CIP where they have very specific projects of large capital cost. But what I'm going to go through the program areas is there could be 15, 20 programs in each area. And so I'll just get into it and you'll see. So Columbia Pike, as you may know, has been going on for quite some time. And what we're trying to do with Columbia Pike is some multimodal efforts. You may be familiar with Segment G, which was 4 Mile Run to South Wakefield, which had an element of some undergrounding to clear obstructions and wider sidewalks. And we're doing very similar type work in another area from 4 Mile Run all the way to the county line, as well as the other direction from Segment G, which we call F, which is South Wakefield to Oakland. We also are working another program area of Crystal City, Pentagon City, and Potomac Yard. Certainly there's a variety of different projects that we're doing in that area. You may recall the bridge the South Clark Street Bridge that went over 18th Street that was just recently removed. As of, I think, tomorrow morning, Crystal Drive in the area of the EPA building will become a two-way street instead of a one-way as today. Another area we're working on is the Rosalind to Ballston corridor. One of the bigger projects that we're almost nearing completion on is the Lynn Street Esplanade. And so that's an enhancement for bike and pedestrian facilities as well. Clarendon Circle is another project in that portfolio, which we're hoping to complete in about a month's time, as well as just recently Wilson Boulevard outside the Highlander. There was some pedestrian improvements with wider sidewalks done there. We also have the Safe Routes to School portfolio. Some of those projects that have been completed is the Ashlawn Elementary School. Surrounding that, some improvements to the sidewalks, as well as McKinley Elementary just recently, with adding bike lanes and some bump outs at the intersections to improve the curb ramps. We also have the Bike Arlington area, which is work that has been done. Actually, it's going to be future work that's underway at the Potomac Yard 4-mile run connection. And we also have another future project going in there where we're doing raised crosswalks at Bluemont Trail crossings for bikes to provide some additional visibility of the pedestrians and bikes crossing there. We also have the Walk Arlington program. One of the examples that just recently was completed was those that was just outside this building at Clarendon Boulevard and 15th, where we widened the sidewalk, as well as did some planting in the area. One of the other areas is bridge renovation. The most recent one of these projects was the North Carolina Springs Road rehabilitation. Two other areas that we don't really have a lot of activity in right now, but I suspect the Lee Highway will be something that we speak a little bit more about once CHPD is done looking at that area for their purposes, as well as the East Falls Church. We have some projects in that area that improve multimodal efforts. We also have the improvements outside major corridors, which is a program that is pretty generic, but it does span the county and arterial streets. And we do spend a lot of money in this area. Recently, we did undergrounding at Lee and Glebe, and another project recently finished was the Old Dominion Sidewalk missing link near the elementary school over there. So that's kind of a general mix of what we're trying to accomplish with the program. And the different program areas. The way that we do that is through a variety of funding sources. It's a mix of federal, state, regional, and local funds. We get those through different taxes, as well as federal and state grants, as well as developer contributions, and as well as regional grants. For example, the NVTA 70% funds that are available, we have to apply for those as competitive projects. But we do fairly well with those projects. So the larger sheet that I gave you kind of gives you an understanding of where our revenue comes from and the bulk of expenditures. I only printed the FY19 and 20 that was recently approved. Obviously, you can look at the transportation capital budget online and see the remaining years. So with that, that's the end of what I was prepared for, but I assume you have lots of questions, so I'm happy to answer anything you have.
Great, thank you very much. Just for some context for my fellow commissioners, we update the capital improvement plan every 2 years, and that update is coming up this spring. So staff, I'm sure, is already working busily behind the scenes to start thinking about what may need to change, what may need to be added, what may need to go away to adjust for changes. Like the fact that 2 of our bridges over 4-mile run are all of a sudden much more structurally deficient than we expected them to be, and that sort of thing. So I asked for this CIP overview so that we all have kind of a general understanding of what this thing is and what the various program areas are and how it gets funded as we get ready for that process in the coming spring. So with that said, do any commissioners have a few quick questions before we move on to the rest of our agenda?
Yeah, I do.
Commissioner Lantelmi.
You're talking about bridge replacement, bridge maintenance. Are the 4-mile run bridges under you or under VDOT?
Those are our bridges to maintain, along with a partnership with Alexandria.
Because they're severely degraded. Apparently, they're under restrictions. What is the plan for actually replacing them?
So I can't get into too much specifics now because it's still kind of in motion, but I can give you some background as to how maybe it became a priority. So each bridge that we have in the county is part of an inspection program, and we look at them at least, I think, every 2 years. On the high priority one is every year. Given the type of bridge that those 2 are, the West Glebe and the Mount Vernon Bridge, they're basically pre-stressed concrete beams And so the rebar is contained within the concrete. You don't get a good look at what that is until the concrete starts falling off of it. Then you will actually see that steel is corroded. My understanding, and I've been with the county about 8 months now, so prior to me starting, was that they were not showing signs of stress until the concrete spalled off. We saw the existing steel is severely corroded enough that we were concerned about potential accelerated deterioration unless we reduce some of the load on the bridge, i.e. the weight restrictions. We expect some additional service out of these bridges, perhaps 2 years, which is just enough for us to start designing and setting up contracts to rebuild these. Unfortunately, it kind of came very quickly. The future bridges will not be steel reinforced concrete. They'll be steel, and it's much more readily accessible for evaluation.
My understanding is we had long-range plans for reconfiguring some of the way those streets are configured, but with the emergency of having to get them done, that's out the window now. Is that still true?
Yeah, I would. It's difficult for me to say anything about Alexandria's plans, but there was a joint 4-mile run master plan that showed West Cleve Bridge being relocated, which has a lot of land use issues related to it. Had we had 10 years of planning in advance of it, certainly I think that conversation would be different than it is today. So right now we are prepared for the worst case scenario that the bridge needs to be closed almost immediately. So we're making plans to fix that bridge.
Okay, and is that now reflected in this?
No, it was not. So this is just the FY 19 and 20 that was adopted prior to the findings on the bridge. You should see some element of the plan forward as it is further figured out internally once it goes from the county manager as a proposal to the county board.
And then switching locations, one short one you mentioned about the Bluemont Trail. Are you going to be doing anything about the intersection of the trail and Kensington? It's a very dangerous intersection there. It's very weirdly configured. There's a blind spot on it for the bikers. Cars can't see a bike coming through. It's not easy to even negotiate.
That is part of the project. It already has somewhat of a raised crossing. I think we can improve upon
Well,
that. But the main issue, I think, is there's a retaining wall in front of one of the properties.
Right.
It obstructs the visibility.
Right.
By moving the curb inward, we can shorten that crossing, but we can also give people a chance to be seen better before they actually enter the street.
So sort of like a bump out then?
Yeah.
Because right now coming up the trail, you're going down, then up over the crown of the street, and then back down again, and then back up again. It's really not a good for anybody. It's not a good experience for anybody using it, either biking or even driving for that matter, I think. So thank you for closely trying to re-engineer that. Okay.
Any other commissioner questions? Commissioner Calkins.
For the FY 2019 funds, do we have a general idea of how much we've spent versus how much we haven't, and if any of that's planned to be rolled over into the next CIP process or not?
Certainly, we have closed the books on FY19. I wasn't prepared to provide that number. If you'd like that, I can research
I'm sure
it.
it'll come up at future meetings.
Anything else? All right, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
The next item is item number 4. This is the Micro-Mobility Ordinance. This is an RTA, request to advertise. Jim Larson is here with Rich Viola to give you an overview.
Good evening. In one of our many continuing discussions. We're really glad to be here. I wanted to make a couple of quick comments before Rich, who's really going to be presenting to you tonight. We have a working team of multiple people showing all the county groups, both in planning and research and several other areas working together. As you will recall, the county manager and also you all and DES leadership have asked us to work together to get to the point where here we are today. And I wanted to thank you for that. I've just finished my 2 years in August. I think half of that time has been devoted to this, and it's been a real interesting challenge and new technology to welcome you. So, Rich, you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. I think I can probably just do it from here.
You want to do it? Okay.
So thank you for having us here. I got it now. As we've been to this commission a few times in the past, so this is really, we're now at a point where we have ordinance changes, actual language, which we're going to bring to the county board at their October meeting. So this is a request to advertise action, and then we will be back to the commission next month, actually, because at that point, we will be having public hearings, and so we want to, from tonight, really, is to introduce you to everything that we've developed so far. We still have a few questions about policies that we really would like feedback on from the commission, so it's a good time for this meeting, and then you will kind of hear again from us again in another month. But anyway, you've gotten a lot of background on our pilot program that's been taking place with the shared mobility devices, e-scooters primarily. I will give you a little bit of kind of that background now, but there's so much more that it's in a document that we would kind of ask that you might want to take a look at. But really, I want to focus more on the kind of the ordinance changes and the policy that's going into that. But just a little bit about what's been happening over the last year or so. We currently have 7 companies that are permitted to have 700 e-bikes and 2,700 e-scooters. On a given day, there are a few e-bikes. Jump is starting to bring those into the county, but there's not a lot on a current basis. And on an average day, 1,000 or so e-scooters are deployed in the county. Just kind of looking at how those are operating. This is some data from the first about 8 to 10 months of the pilot program. You can see that there was upwards of about 70 to 80,000 trips on e-scooters per month towards the summer. That's more actually than we were seeing on Capital Bike Share. However, those trips on the e-scooters tend to be kind of short, roughly about a mile on average, and shorter much than the bike ones are. We'll see when we see more of the e-bikes, the jump bikes, how that might change too. But in any case, a little bit about some research that was done with users of the e-scooters and e-bikes. We kind of asked them, what other form of mode of travel would you have used for this trip? A certain percent of the trips people said they would not make if they didn't have access to that micromobility device. But for the majority, it would have been a walking trip. However, quite a lot, if you look at the next couple of rows down underneath walking, those are general use of motor vehicles. So there's a pretty high percentage, almost a third of these trips are displacing use of automobiles, taxi cabs, Ubers, things of that nature. And there's not a whole lot of diversion from other forms of public transit, such as buses, metro rails, or bicycling, like Capital Bike Share, which we find is a good thing. A little bit about kind of more information from the people that were using these and kind of how they told us where they were riding. Quite a lot of them would try to use bike lanes or have a preference for using bike lanes or kind of shared lanes. But we also do have a substantial amount of people who are using the sidewalks and a small amount of people who are using trails with the e-scooters. When you ask them the question where they prefer to ride, it very much shifts towards, I would like to be able to ride in a protected bike lane, or I'd like to be able to use the bike lane. Those facilities are not always available. So that the tendency is people have to use what is there, and that's always a sidewalk or potentially use of the street. So there's a preference there for better facilities from the users. We spent a lot of time getting input from people at various opportunities. Almost everybody seems to have an opinion about the e-scooters and e-bikes. Some of the things that we heard from quite substantially, and you've heard this as well, is that there's concern about sidewalk riding, particularly are the hazards or discomfort for people who are pedestrians, maybe folks in wheelchairs or somewhat have a disability who have to share a sidewalk with a kind of a moving vehicle. Also concerns about where the scooters are winding up, where they're being parked, how maybe they be, kind of in places that are inappropriate, either on the sidewalk or in parks or places such as that. A lot about behavior of the users, underage riding, persons who operate the scooters are supposed to be 18 or older if they're renting one. There's quite a lot of use of teenagers and even folks younger than teens who have been getting on them. But also behavior of, are they yielding to pedestrians? Are they kind of stopping for stop signs or going the correct direction when they're traveling in the street, such as that. So there is a lot of complaint that we've got along that line as well. And just sort of the concerns about the safety of the streets. Are our streets developed such that they could be used by all sorts of forms of travel, and are there facilities available for everybody? And then largely, there's another one that maybe the staff has brought up more than anything else is the equity of the programs. Are we seeing enough distribution across the county of availability of the e-scooters in particular? And does everyone kind of have an equal opportunity to get on one, or are there barriers that kind of prevent certain people via income, via language, via kind of whether they have a driver's license or not? Those sorts of barriers that we want to make sure that aren't going to be there in the future. So just to kind of summarize our pilot, basically what we came out of this was that the micromobility devices are being well used. I mentioned earlier 75 to 80,000 trips per month is quite a lot. The users like them. It's very convenient for them to have one more form of transportation that available to them, particularly if they're in a place such as the RB corridor or down near Route 1 where there are an abundance of these devices. Areas where we need to kind of regulate and to look at how we can do better are largely in the areas of addressing sidewalk riding, parking, the speeds that they're used, and what's the appropriate speed for them, and sort of getting out the word about better behavior and what's correct and proper, and what laws apply. And then also, can we build a kind of a more equitable system? And lastly, as what we've learned from this, from one of the conclusions from this pilot study is that really there is a more of an established need for better infrastructure on the streets. What we used to call bike lanes are really much more than bike lanes these days because there are a lot of other things using them. So our proposed regulations fall in two areas. One is we have a section 14.2, Article 2 of the county code, which is primarily dealing with bicycles. We found that these devices are pretty much the same as bikes in many ways, in their size, in their behavior, in their speed, in their carrying capacity. And so therefore, they really should be regulated along the same lines as bicycles. So what we've been proposing to do is expanding this area that's Article 2, which refers to bicycles, to really include many more micromobility devices. So I'll talk to that in a minute. And then we're creating a new section to the county code, Article 10, which will be the permitting program that the companies will have to be going through, and I'll explain that as well. So just first to go through the code changes, this is where we're actually revising existing language within the county code. So regarding where people should be riding, currently on streets, basically all these devices are allowed to ride on any street that has a speed limit of 35 miles per hour or less, and that's by Virginia code. One question that we've had brought to us is, should there be some prohibition from having these kind of lower speed vehicles operating on arterial streets with a 35 or a 30 mile per hour speed limit? So that's a question that I throw out there for the commissioners if they'd like to answer it. As well as bicycle lanes. Currently, bicycles and e-bikes are allowed to use them today. That's the only ones who are legal users. We are proposing to allow e-scooters, motorized skateboards, and the other types of micromobility devices to use those bike lanes as well. Today, bicycles, and I should say also e-bikes, are allowed to use sidewalks. That's the current law. We are proposing to allow the other micromobility devices to use the sidewalks, as many of them are currently doing, except for cases where we post them, where we've determined that that particular sidewalk is not appropriate, and we post signs that that should not be used by those sorts of devices. And I can get into that a little more as well. And then we are proposing that where there's a protected bike lane, that the micromobility user should be in the protected bike lane and not in the sidewalk in that location. And so another question we've had brought to us is, should we just ban them from sidewalks? And that's something we are trying to address. And if we do allow them on sidewalk, what sort of conditions should we impose upon their use? What kind of permitted speed and such? Lastly, I want to talk about trails. Currently, it's only bicycles that are allowed on the county trails. Some of our neighbors who run trails, such as the National Park Service and Nova Parks, which owns the WNOD trail, have begun to allow other micromobility devices, such as e-bikes and e-scooters, to use those trails. We're proposing to do the same thing so that all of these devices would be permissible to use the county trail system. One question that has come up from people is, should we impose a speed limit on trails, which currently do not have them? If you want to talk about speeds, I can kind of show you which streets in the county have speed limits of above 25 miles an hour. The ones in purple in this image have 30-mile-an-hour speed limits, and the few in the gold color are 35 mile an hour, and those are also listed on the far right. I'll just kind of keep going through. If folks, I think it would be best that I just run through the presentation. Okay, I'll do that. Okay, so the other code changes we've talked about are changing some of the travel speeds. Currently under a pilot program, the for-hire devices, such as the e-scooters, can only go 10 miles per hour. They're supposed to be governed such that it cannot go faster than that. We are proposing to make a change so that they can go up to 15 miles per hour. We think that's actually a better speed for operation on streets. It lessens the differential between that speed of that e-scooter and the motor vehicle traffic, which they sometimes have to mix with. But we would also like to impose a restriction when they're used on sidewalks, and that they could be no more than 6 miles per hour when on the sidewalk. The same would apply to motorized skateboards. They don't have any regulations today. Mostly they are owned by individuals. There's no company renting them. But we would like to see them limited to a 15 miles per hour on the street and 6 miles per hour if they're used on sidewalk. In the area of parking, this has come up quite a bit. We've taken the existing language within the county code, and that's what you see in sort of that black-colored text, and we've modified it. And in the area where it's green, we're adding, and in the few places where it's red, it's where we're removing it. And so largely what we're trying to do is broaden this out, so the same regulations that apply to today to bicycles would be applied to e-bikes, e-scooters, motorized skateboards, and the like. We are adding some language at the very end where we're trying to be more specific as to places where they are not permitted to park, and that largely references we do not want them obstructing curb ramps, in bus stops or fire accesses, and that within county-owned public spaces such as county parks, they should park only where they're specifically designated or through a sign that says that they should park there, or where there's a provision of racks, like bicycle racks, for their use. The one place where we're making a change to restrict them a little bit more is one of the things we've learned from our discussions with people is that having a bicycle or a scooter or something adjacent to the side of a building can be a hazard for a person who is maybe visually impaired. They often use that edge of the building to kind of help them navigate down a sidewalk. So we'd like to make sure that that area is clean. So we're going to propose that bikes and other devices not be parked along the edge of a building. They instead be out towards the curb or in a more designated bicycle parking or scooter parking area. And I'll talk a little bit about the new part of the county code, the Article X or 10. We have a permitting process for the for-hire shared services companies. Currently, we have them under a memorandum of agreement, MOA. This would be a more permanent manner of regulating the companies. We're going to use sort of the model of how we regulate taxi cabs, and we have kind of developed a system of permitting that's very similar to that. Kind of walk you through that. Each company would have to apply for a permit before they could begin their operation again. And so their permit would specify how many vehicles they would be allowed to operate. That's very similar to what I have under the MOA. And we would be awarding permits based upon their satisfying certain criteria that we specify in our application process. And we'd like those criteria to kind of match up with our master transportation plan, which has goals and objectives. So we will be asking certain things of the companies as they come in with their applications. And during the course of operations, if a company was found to be not following up on the things that they said they were going to do, or had substantial amount of violations by their customers, or they themselves are not operating correctly, the county would have the ability to revoke or suspend their permit so that they would be out of business for a certain time period while that permit was revoked. The permit would be something that would have to be renewed every year as well, so that if we were having a particular problem with a certain company, we could choose to not renew their permit as well. And that there would be some fees that they would have to pay. Initially, an application fee to kind of cover a lot of the staff time that goes into processing it, doing all the background investigation that is needed for it. That's a fairly minimal amount of money. It's only about $1,000. But on an annual basis, they would be paying for the use of having their vehicles in the county right-of-way, which is where they're doing their business, essentially, using our county streets and sidewalks for their business. They would be paying a fee of about $80 per vehicle per year, which we've checked around the country, and that's a very average number. They range quite a lot, from $20 a year to hundreds of dollars a year. We think $80 is a pretty good number. We also think with about 1,000 vehicles operating per day on our county streets, that would give us $80,000 plus dollars, and that's probably what we need in terms of the money for the staff time that we're putting into operating such a program, and for some of the materials that would be needed as well. Potentially, if the number of vehicles out there starts to grow and it becomes more like the 3,000 or so that they're permitted, there would be probably additional money that the county would be receiving that could be applied to some infrastructural improvements targeted towards maybe additional parking areas, or creating some protected bike lanes, something like that as well. A couple of things that have come up. We've identified in our ordinance proposal that there could be a need for a cap on the maximum number of vehicles. We'd like to leave that to the discretion of the county manager, particularly because now we have a very young industry that is growing in a kind of a dynamic way. We will be seeing, I think, over the next year to two, changes within the industry as far as the number of companies and the types of vehicles out there. So we want to leave some flexibility for the manager to step in if he sees that things are getting a little out of control. We can set a limit on that, but also don't want to constrain it too much at this time. Vehicle equipment, there's a lot of specifications about that. We want safety out of each vehicle. And then regarding some manners of company service, such things as how they treat their customers, how people can make a complaint if they have an issue with a scooter left in front of their yard or something like that. But also, how are they going to react to emergencies, things like that. We're specifying certain things as part of this permit process. All companies would have to have adequate insurance and some bonding, which would protect the county. If, for example, they went out of business and left these devices all over the county, we would have ability to kind of collect on that and dispose of them properly. We also want to see the companies undertake safety and education for their customers. There are lots of ways they can do that, through their apps, through their advertisements, by holding training classes, by paying for ads in various places, and then also, addressing adequate as part of just safety. But also there's things that the county should do as well. And so we've done things in the past regarding bike safety and pedestrian safety and street motorist safety. And we probably will have to broaden that to address micromobility devices as well. Our PAL program is one example of what things that we've done. And then we want to see a few measures towards equity. One is a more equitable distribution. Right now, almost all of them wind up in the Rosalind, Ballston, or down Route 1 corridors where the transit stations are. And there's certainly a lot of demand in those areas, but in order for people to get to the transit stations, oftentimes they need to have something near their homes. And so we want to see more distribution into other parts of Arlington. And we're proposing a minimum of 15% of the devices that are deployed each morning have to be outside of those corridors. And there are other things that could be done as far as kind of multilingual outreach, discounting fares for persons with lower incomes. And right now, most of the companies, I think all the companies, require that you have a driver's license in order to get access to their service. We'd like to see that eliminated so that people who don't have driver's licenses would have access as well. They're probably have a higher need for them than anyone else. A few other kind of considerations I'll just bring up. We've had some concerns about are these devices being used late at night by folks who may be inebriated, leaving a bar or restaurant or something like that, and would it be best for safety if they were turned off or made not available at late night hours? Also, I mentioned the cap. Should there be one? Largely, should there be some other incentives that the county provides to kind of get devices that maybe persons with a disability could use? Perhaps there's some sort of tricycle or kind of extra mobility type of device that could be put into use as well. We're open to that idea. And then can we get more resources from these companies so that they're actually improving the infrastructure in our right-of-way that they are making their profits from? So this is sort of the next steps. We are going to the county board meeting at their October 19th with a request to advertise. I expect that's going to be not on a consent agenda, but on the county's regular agenda. It might wind up being the Tuesday night, not the Saturday. We will be back to with the commission for a public hearing at your October 30th meeting. Then our next meeting after that was with the county board on November 16th for the final public hearing. We need the kind of ordinance to go into effect before the end of this year. There is a state-imposed deadline on localities that they put something in place by January 1st, or else state regulations would override anything the county would be working on. So our goal is to have this go into effect probably December 31st. And that 1 year after the ordinance goes into effect, staff will come back with an evaluation. We'll kind of evaluate how things are going, what maybe needs to be changed, and we'll provide that report to the various county bodies, and we'll determine whether we need to make some additional changes. So that's it for the presentation. Open for questions. Also, Gideon Berger is here, who is also one of our large team that's been working on our program, as well as Jim Larson. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's start with if any commissioners have clarifying questions, and then we'll get into some of the questions that staff had for us as far as direction and comments, and eventually moving towards a motion. Commissioner Clement, you want to kick things off? Can you use your mic?
Does Virginia law require that Arlington permit the use of shared mobility devices on sidewalks and trails, or just streets?
It does not require the county. However, if the county does not impose its own regulations, then the state will input its regulations in effect January 1 of 2020, and they would be allowing use of sidewalks by micromobility devices.
All right, follow-on question. If that were to happen, would they impose speed restrictions, or would they prohibit the imposition of speed restrictions?
I don't believe they'd be imposing any speed speed restriction other than 20 miles per hour as a maximum speed.
Would they, if they imposed their law on us, would we forfeit the right to limit speed restrictions?
Yes, I think we would. I'm not an attorney, but I think we would. If anything comes down from the state, it overrides any local regulation.
Okay.
I should mention, though, if the county were to choose to prohibit riding on the street, we can do that so long as we take action before the end of this year.
Okay.
Commissioner Calkins.
Thanks. Just a couple of things to clarify things for myself. Does this change the cap per company? And what is the current cap per company?
I can go back to that first slide. Most of them, it's 350. One company, Bird, has been asking for increasing amounts, so we've upped theirs because they've shown the willingness to put the devices out and they have the use. We would probably restart with some sort of number, and we might begin with these numbers, but I think we need to, amongst staff, kind of figure out if we want to lower the number to begin with. Maybe a lot of these companies haven't been putting the 350 out there. They put a fraction of that, so we might change that.
Okay, but that is not in the ordinance.
Ordinance does not specify that.
Okay.
That's all within the.
Second question, I follow.
Okay.
Is the number of companies capped by the ordinance?
No, it's not.
So it's an unlimited number. And then my third question is, do we have a defined geography that defines the Rosalind-Ballston corridor and then the Route 1 corridor where that 15% would have to be placed outside of?
We don't specify that as language in the ordinance, but the county does have
I think that needs to
in our
be
planning processes.
specified in the ordinance, but that's I guess that's a
Okay.
comment, not a clarification.
Commissioner Lantalmy.
Yeah, I have a couple of clarifying questions. For the caps, maybe I'm not fully understanding it. Given we have 7 companies, and there's probably more out there that could come in, at some point there's going to be a shakeout, they're going to start merging. Does that affect the cap for those companies? Because if 2 of them have a cap of 350, if they merge, clearly Burt has 600, so we could allow the merged company to retain each of its 350, so it would have 700?
I mean, if a company has a permit for 350, and I guess if another company also has a permit for 350, and they merge together, I think we're open to allowing the combined company to having 700. But we might, at some point, decide that might be too many and ask them to reduce their numbers as well. And the companies would have an option to either increase or decrease their number they want to operate.
But we have flexibility to
Yes.
allow, okay, because I'm pretty sure that at some point there will be a shakeout, but, so, okay, that's good. Let's see. Oh, you mentioned about theoretically maybe restricting these vehicles on arterials that have speed limits between 30 and 35 miles an hour. Do we have any arterials that meet that criterion that physically do not have the room for a bike lane? I can think maybe Washington Boulevard in some parts would be that way. What I'm thinking is if we ban them from riding on the sidewalk, but we also ban them from being in the street, we'll have certain streets where they simply cannot be used.
Right. Very few of the streets that have a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit currently have bike lanes. There's just a portion of Old Dominion Drive, I believe, that has them today. And some of Lee Highway has a bike lane. But almost all of those streets have no bike lane. And I don't know if they can be added in the future. I think that's a possibility. But
Well, some,
current condition is they're
no
not
room.
there. Yeah.
So we have to really think that through because we're going to essentially be banning these vehicles from those streets, not just the street, but using that anywhere on that right-of-way, sidewalk, street, parking lane, whatever, because it's simply, they're not allowed.
Commissioner Price.
Actually, speaking of banning, I have I guess a clarifying question regarding riding on sidewalks. obviously, according to the ordinance, it's going to be permitted. But you say here, except for those sidewalks designated by the county manager. Is there a process by which the county manager is going to follow that's outlined that's going to, are we going to pick and choose what sidewalks are for, what sidewalks are, are not going to be allowed? Is it going to be based on, our civic association is going to be involved in this process? I'm worried about the kind of patchwork. Personally, I'm going to say I'm a huge fan of motorized scooters. I think they're wonderful, and I use them myself. So I'm worried about a patchwork of what can be used, what can't be used, and utter confusion with the rider, for the rider.
Right. I think we want to make sure that everything is understandable by the general public. We don't want to make it too confusing for people. But so any place we would ban them, we would have to adequately sign that ban or prohibition is in place in that location. So that's one thing that I want to say. But we do not have a set criteria yet as to where these would be prohibited. Our feelings are that there may be some locations around metro stations, for example, where you have a high density of pedestrians, a lot of crossing traffic, and in those sorts of situations, it may be hazardous to have moving vehicles up in the sidewalk as well. But we have not yet worked out exactly what criteria to use, and I think that's something that staff would like to work on if this becomes part of the ordinance.
That would concern me that I also bicycle too. So would that mean bicycles wouldn't be used as well, as it's only going to apply to?
Well, I think that would probably be the outcome too. In those blocks, we would not have bicycle riding on the sidewalk as well as the e-scooters and the motorized skateboards and such. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other commissioner questions? Commissioner Raddick, right? Just ignore the J? Is that okay?
That's correct. You mentioned in your report that GPS is not accurate enough to distinguish between a sidewalk and a road as far as where the scooter is located at that point in time. You mentioned that, I guess the recommendation would be to go 6 miles per hour on the sidewalk if you're in a scooter, and then 15 maximum on the road, which means the absolute max for the scooter would be 15. So someone could conceivably go 15 on the sidewalk if they wanted to. That's what
that is a possibility. It's something that we're concerned about. Yes.
What do you propose any enforcement, or is it just self-select kind of?
We've had a lot of discussions with our police force on this, and they feel that it would be pretty much close to impossible to enforce a 6 mile an hour speed limit. If enforcing means having someone out there writing tickets for everyone who goes 7 or 8 or 9 miles per hour, they don't feel that that's something that they could really do in any kind of effective manner. So we're largely going to rely upon education and basically people doing self-selection, and they realize how fast they are going. The devices are all supposed to have a speedometer. Most of them currently do, so that they would be able to see how fast they're going and moderate their speed so that they're, traveling 6 or less.
I could, if it helps, I could tell you where the 6 mile per hour idea came from.
Yeah, that'd be great.
If you operate them at less than 5 miles an hour, they're not very stable. So 5 is about the minimum speed you need to maintain balance on them. And of course, a pedestrian will walk at about, 3 miles per hour. You'll jog at about 6 miles an hour. So bringing them to the speed of someone running on the sidewalk, that was about as slow as you could regulate them. The other neighboring jurisdictions are sort of grappling with this as well, and other jurisdictions around the country too. Some have taken the approach, but as Rich mentioned, enforcement for speeding on the sidewalk is extremely difficult. Enforcement for someone riding recklessly can be done when it's witnessed, the same way it is for driving riding any vehicle. But yeah, they're not going to be out there with a radar gun for the sidewalk.
Correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner Price.
As a follow-up to that question, throughout the pilot, were there any tickets written for riders? I assume we have all these rules in place, and did anybody break a rule that was caught? and ticketed?
I'm trying to think back. I think maybe 2 or 3 tickets were given specifically, but I really should check that out to make sure I'm correct.
Pretty sure officers warned people about it.
There were a lot of warnings, particularly during the early part of the pilot. A lot of education, stopping them, not giving tickets, but not aggressively enforced, I would say, at that point.
Because I also want to echo what was said. I think if we're going to do this, not to build in sort of an enforcement mechanism into this, encouragement within law enforcement to be more proactive, I think if we did that would send a very positive sign to the community.
Thank you. We've actually talked to the police department that if this goes into effect, doing some kind of spot enforcement up the corridor, try to send a message aggressively to the rider what's going on. That's one idea we have. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, so I have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to say to my fellow commissioners, if you have, interrupt me, flag me down at any time in the middle of my 20 questions, and that's totally cool. Commissioner Clement, did you have another question?
Yeah, it just so happens that tonight I was visiting my physical therapist, and I mentioned this new plan that's going into effect, and he said, well, gee, that's a shame. He said, I was wiped out on my bike near Gravelly Point a few months ago by a kid who was on an e-scooter, who was clearly underage, and who was not in control of his vehicle. And I took evasive action, but was unsuccessful and wiped out. And, I was hurt. And he said, so no, this idea that we have to do this because it's popular raises more questions than it answers. Popular to whom and for what purpose? The other thing I want to point out is that he said that his business, physical therapy, has actually improved in recent months because there are a lot of people who ride e-scooters who have come in with injuries. So I feel that this whole plan is off base. And I absolutely oppose a 15-mile speed limit on trails. It's one thing to wipe out a healthy adult male on a bike. It's another thing to wipe out a woman with a child on a stroller on the WNOD trail or somebody in a wheelchair. So I really believe this is beyond irresponsible. I believe this is facilitating reckless endangerment, and I can't support it.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to jump straight into the actual ordinance. So here, when it's talking about multi-use trails, it appears to define a multi-use trail by essentially incorporating the bicycle element of the MTP into this ordinance and saying it's a trail if it's considered a trail in the MTP. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So essentially, we're requiring somebody to know the MTP map, to know what is a sidewalk versus what is a trail from a speed limit purpose, for speed limit purposes.
Yeah, there is some overlap where we have trails designated that, look just like sidewalks because they're side paths to a road. So, yeah.
Yeah, like the north side of Columbia Pike, for instance, is a giant question mark in my head on, is it a trail or is it a sidewalk?
And that's what gives me pause to put like a speed limit on a trail per se, because it could give the wrong message in some cases, I think.
All right. Okay. So, and you said earlier, most of the e-scooters, at least the ones for hire from places like Bird and Lyft, have speedometers. But
Yes.
the speed limit as outlined in the ordinance applies to all e-scooters, no matter where you get them from. Do most e-scooters that one might go into a sporting goods store and purchase also have speedometers?
I would think that many of them don't, but I don't know all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not allowed to regulate the private scooters by current law.
So they would simply have to operate 15 miles an hour by their own kind of device without perhaps not having an odometer.
We've actually flagged that at the legislative level to try to look into that.
Because this sure looks like the whole front portion here applies to a privately owned e-scooter, but that's not true.
Well, it's intended to apply to really all micro-mobility devices, and there are quite a lot of things, but they are defined by state code as either being electric power-assisted bicycle, electric-assisted scooter, or a motorized skateboard, and that's kind of a broad term as well. So we want to make sure we can get all these types of things that are out there operating in the county regulated in some manner. Certainly what everyone is familiar with is the scooters that Bird, Lyft, Lime, and all the others operate. So,
But maybe it might help to differentiate. The permitting system only applies to the for-hire industry.
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
The permitting regime that was proposed only is regulating the for-hire industry. It doesn't regulate the
That
privately
I
owned.
fully expected and understood based on how the ordinance is laid out. My question is things like you can't ride an e-scooter faster than 6 miles an hour on a sidewalk. Does that apply if I have purchased my own scooter from a sporting goods store?
I think that's a county attorney question.
well, I think that's the intent.
It sure looks like the intent.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's a safety measure, and we feel it should apply to anybody with a motorized device.
Do we have
Commissioner
the same?
Calkins?
Do we? And I guess my question would be like, and do we have the same policy for both rented and privately owned bikes as well? So if we're applying a speed limit to scooters, I really think it should be applied to bikes as well, because a scooter and a bike, when they hit you, the bike's actually worse. And if we're regulating scooters on the sidewalks and their speed limits, whether or not we think it's enforceable or not, we should be setting a speed limit for bikes as well.
So for the
And
sidewalks,
debate what that speed limit should be separately. But if we're setting a speed limit for one, we should be setting a speed limit where it shouldn't just be bikes, it should be everything. Or scooters, it should be applied.
Bicycles are the original micro-mobility device.
Yes.
They just beat all these other devices to the streets by about 200 years. Yes.
so yes, on a sidewalk, all these vehicles, 6 miles per hour is expected as the maximum speed. The ones that are for hire, we have a bit more regulation, we have a little more leverage over, and we can state that they can be governed so they cannot go higher than 15 miles an hour. And so that's what we will be doing. We really don't have the same sort of ability to control somebody's motorized skateboard or other device, yeah.
Commissioner Lantelme, you trying to get in here?
Yeah, this applies to electric assisted vehicles. Regular bikes routinely go 15 to 25 miles an hour all over the county, on streets, on trails, on sidewalks, and they're not covered, of course. You also have a definitional problem here with the e-vehicles because there are way more than just the ones that are mentioned here. There's more than just scooters and bicycles and hoverboards. There are now, I watch them go by my street all the time because my porch is my office. And there are electric unicycles, there are boards with a big fat tire in the middle, the only one wheel. There will no doubt eventually be electrically assisted rollerblades. All of these things are electric vehicles. They are privately owned. They have no speedometers and never will. And some of them can go pretty fast. But they're all, as a lawyer, they will not be covered by this because they're specifically not mentioned. So I'm just saying we have a big gap here.
There is a general, within the Virginia law that kind of governs a lot of this, there is some general statements that kind of create what a micromobility device is, specify what it is. And they seem to cover a lot of those things that you just mentioned.
Then we should have our statute refer to that to make sure that it is covered, because we're being so specific here that I would certainly, if I was defending somebody, I'd say, it's not covered. Here's the language. It's explicitly not covered because they're so specific on what is covered. We have scooters now that have seats they're going by. Now, I did see that you excluded the essentially handicapped-assisted motorized vehicles, such as motorized wheelchairs, the scooters that handicapped people use. That's very important that we do that.
Yes.
And I want to make sure that's clear all the way through for speed limits and for every, for whatever, because they have to use the sidewalks. And that includes areas where they would otherwise, we would be banning electric vehicles. Those signs have to say something like, except for handicapped accessible or something like that. That's going to be very important. But yeah, I have a whole list of other things which I won't go into. This time I'll let you guys go before I hit the other ones.
Commissioner Calkins.
So kind of pivoting off of that, what is explicitly said in here and legally enforceable, I am going to, because we're in comment period now, right? Come back to my comment that we need a geographical definition and a map that is referenced for those two corridors where we want to see these devices implemented outside of from an equity perspective, or else we will not have an ability to say whether or not and evaluate whether or not these providers have done it. I would also like to encourage a slightly higher percentage to be placed outside of those two corridors. They're going to place them where their most users are, and that is going to be the RB corridor and the Route 1 corridor, and whether or not that is where people would like to be using them. If they don't place more than 15% outside, then people won't have the ability to use them from their houses, from maybe their garden apartments in the areas outside those corridors in. And I don't know if we want to do it, but I think we might want to consider even having a mount that needs to be placed in the Columbia Pike corridor. So we have a percentage that needs to be placed outside of the RB corridor and the Route 1 corridor, but also a percentage that needs to be placed in the Columbia Pike corridor, because I do think they probably provide a lot of access for people from the buses on Columbia Pike back to their neighborhoods.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, I still have questions.
Okay.
It's okay. So there's this great definition section in Article 10, which my understanding is gets placed kind of pretty close to the end of 14.2. But a lot of these definitions seem to be needed far earlier in the ordinance. Like these, the way it's formatted, these seem like definitions that are just for this whole permitted for hire section. But like that's where protected bike lane gets defined. But protected bike lane, the protected bike lane like regulation, the reason we need it for regulatory purposes is back in the beginning of 14.2, where we're saying, even not talking about for hire, like you can't ride on a sidewalk if there's a protected bike lane available. So I don't read a lot of laws. Maybe that's normal. Maybe that's typical. It's confusing to me as a general person. It feels like if these definitions apply to all of 14.2, they should be at like the beginning of 14.2. Sorry.
Thanks.
This was supposed to be a question, so like,
Yeah. But
normal?
But I understand what you're saying, and it sounds like it makes a lot of sense. So we'll look into that.
It also, I find it confusing because it defines multi-use trail, which we defined earlier as basically being a trail is what we say is a trail in the MTP, but here defines it based on like how wide it is and that there's a yellow stripe running down the middle of it, which seems contradictory. Next question. All right, into the permitting process. 14.2-115, changes in the number of permitted vehicles per permit holder. The permit holder is responsible for maintaining its fleet size within Arlington County plus or minus 5% of their permitted number of vehicles. I get the plus, like you give them a little bit of wiggle room to go over like what their like fleet size is. I'm concerned about only minus 5%. Because as we saw during the pilot, this is a very seasonal thing, right? These companies are going to want to have a fleet size that they use for all of the nice weather months. And then they're going to want to drop how many vehicles they have out there in, well, I would say October, but apparently it's going to be 97 degrees all of October. In November, December, January, February. That seems like something we would not actually want to enforce is, hey, your fleet size is 350 and you only have 300 out, like that's a problem. I don't think that's a problem. And then C, in that same section, Arlington County may decrease the permit holder's permitted fleet size by any amount for any month in which the permit holder cannot demonstrate at least 2 trips per vehicle per day for the entire prior month for 90% of its maximum permitted fleet size. Can you talk about what the for 90% of its maximum permitted fleet size is intended to do in that language?
I believe it's really intended to kind of address that there are certain vehicles that may be out of service for periods of time. So we don't want to require that, kind of a phantom vehicle is actually getting trips. So we're allowing them a certain amount of leeway by only saying for 90% as opposed to 100.
I feel like in the pilot, all of our math here was basically like average number of trips per vehicle per day. And this seems to get away from that very simple number and start looking at like average number of trips per vehicle per day for each vehicle. And I'm afraid that that sabotages our equity requirements, that we're going to come out and we're going to have providers getting into a place where they're not meeting that criteria because they are spreading their vehicles out like we have asked them to. We have asked them to spread out vehicles to places outside the RB corridor, and so they have 15% of their vehicles are not hitting 2 trips per vehicle per day because they're in less densely populated areas.
Okay.
Oh, and then I think, yeah, just double checking with what Commissioner Calkins mentioned earlier. I don't see it in here. Is it that I'm missing it, that we don't define what the Rosalind, Ballston, and Route 1 development corridors are anywhere in the ordinance?
That's correct. We haven't identified them. Our thought was that staff would just provide that information to the companies.
Just from an enforcement perspective, having dealt with this, you need a map to show them where the lines are, or else legally you won't have a leg to stand on to tell them that they aren't meeting your goals.
Okay.
Is there a reason why it wouldn't be included in the ordinance? I mean, too prescriptive?
There's more flexibility under the permitting regime, right? So whatever you put in the ordinance, if you want to change it, we've got to amend the ordinance. So that's a rationale for having more specificity in the permitting process versus in the ordinance itself. So, these corridors are well-established areas that are often used as, units for statistical analysis within our county. But
then
defining them would be helpful. Definitely.
Yeah, but then you can define it as how the county uses it. I mean, we can't just leave it loosey-goosey. It has to be a specific thing that you're referring to, so that even that thing, so that can be changed administratively, but the statute should refer to that specific thing that can be changed administratively.
And it can, maintain the flexibility to change them, but to refer to it specifically. Yeah.
Right.
All right, cool. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, I just want to I want to flag one thing that jumped out at me that is wholly unrelated to micromobility, but jumped out at me because this is the first time I've actually read this ordinance in any sort of detail. 14, section what used to be F and is now E, where the county board has by ordinance designated a bicycle lane for the exclusive use of bicycles, is the section that, as far as I can tell, basically makes it illegal to park in a bike lane. We've installed a lot of bike lanes in Arlington County since I've been here, and I can't remember the county board ever passing a new ordinance to add a bike lane to the list of bike lanes. And I went and looked. It's not included in this paper copy, but I went to the county code on the website. But in the ordinance lays out streets like Joyce Street from X spot to Y spot as being bicycle lanes, and it's real incomplete at this point. Really, really, really incomplete. Probably not given that we're on a tight schedule with the Virginia Code and everything here to get this passed, probably not something that wants to be addressed now, but I think desperately needs to be addressed. I doubt whether I don't think we give out a lot of tickets for parking in the bike lane, but clearly we give out some. I'm not sure some of them are enforceable if that bike lane is not in the ordinance. So maybe a follow-up process that we want to do next year is to go out and rip that out and say bicycle lanes as designated in the master transportation plan or something like that would be wise. And I think as part of that process, it might be good to say, what is the fine for parking in a bike lane? Where is that defined? Because I don't see it anywhere in the ordinance. Maybe this is just me not being a lawyer and not understanding all of that. But I think a lot of that could use some updating in the near future. All right. So is this your main questions we have for the Transportation Commission slide that you're looking for feedback on?
Primarily, yes. So there's one other one, but I would start with this.
Great. Does anybody want to opine on any of these particular questions? As far as should e-bikes, e-scooters, and motorized skateboards be prohibited from riding in the general travel lanes on arterial streets with a 30 or 35 mile an hour speed limit? Are we cool with allowing e-scooters and motorized skateboards in bike lanes? Should micromobility devices be allowed on sidewalks? And if so, should they have a speed limit, et cetera, et cetera?
Well,
Commissioner Land, tell me.
we have to allow them in bike lanes because people are using them in bike lanes right now. There's no way you're going to keep them out of bike lanes. I mean, that's absurd. So we have to have the law catch up to reality. The reality is people use them. People want to use them. Your own survey showed people really, really want to use these things. I've used them because they feel safer that way. So we want to do that. So the answer is yes, we want them in there. I am a bit concerned about treating the e-bikes different from bikes. Because right now bikes have the same rights as cars do or motor vehicles do on our streets, unless they're specifically banned like on the interstates. Yet we're now going to be treating e-bikes differently than regular bikes on our streets. We're going to have to really think that through. In my own head, I'm having a problem with how to deal with this because because I do see bicycles as being different from a skateboard and from a scooter. So we're going to have to parse that out. It's not all
we
e-things are the
actually
same.
see them as being the same, e-bikes and bicycles, and so they would be treated the same. There is a restriction it's more of a kind of a mechanical restriction in that e-bikes, the motor tends to kick off at 20 miles per hour, so they tend to not go much beyond 20 miles unless they're a downhill ride. So, but that's the only
We
difference
have a lot
between
of downhills here.
Yeah.
And the e-bike's going to have to be braking the whole way. I mean, I love the downhills, when I'm on my bike, because I can go really fast. It helps me get up the next hill.
Anybody else want Commissioner Price?
I also want to echo, I want to see these regulated as we regulate bicycles. I bicycle to work. If I need to get into an arterial, a street that goes 30, 35 miles an hour, I try to do it as infrequently as I possibly can. But if I need to do that, I will do that. It's from getting from point A to point B. I want to see these regulated like bicycles. I want to see equity in this process. And as far as I can tell, I'm looking at all these questions. That's what I would like to say about that particular process. My concern again is regarding road prohibition. Is a patchwork of roads that you can versus what you can't, and we're going to have signage is just going to drive people who are using these micromobility devices as well as people who use bicycles absolutely nuts. So I would really, if you're going to outline, if there's going to be, you need to outline a process because it could get political very quickly. I mean, I can see civic associations complaining vehemently, I want my sidewalks, for pedestrians versus other ones who are open to it. So which community is going to be in favor, which communities be against that? Again, there needs to be a process outlined, and we need to be clear about that. I saw questions about having a cap on the number of devices. Unless you're going to cap the number of lifts, the number of Ubers, unless we're going to get all aggressive on the TNCs, I would not advise going crazy on micromobility devices. And also, I saw something about late night restrictions with Metro and transit service in the late evenings suffering for those people who are transit dependent. If this could be a source, moving people, then I would not do late night restrictions. Again, if we're looking at revisiting this ordinance within the next year, and then I don't know how many years after that, if we're going to constantly revisit these devices to either add devices or change part of the ordinance, up front, I would say no to a cap. But I would continue to revisit this issue going down based on the number of accidents you see and more of the study that you're doing on this. Thank you.
I want to support my fellow commissioner on that. This is an equity issue. Late night hours have to be allowed because, first of all, is this even a problem? How many drunk scooter accidents have we had? And wouldn't we have it on bicycles too? But the other question, this is the reason why we opened our bike trails at night is because we have a lot of service workers who get off at midnight, 1, 2 in the morning. Metro stopped running, as you pointed out. The bus service is terrible. This is the way they get home. If you go to the bike trails late at night, you will see beater bikes going by all the time, people getting from their jobs. This is important. This is very much of an equity issue. We have to allow them to be used.
Commissioner Calkins.
I will echo that. We don't turn people's cars off after midnight, which would be the bigger safety issue. Can we? Can we go back to the question slide for where they should operate? I will caveat this on the fact that I have not ridden a scooter and they scare me personally, but that's because I know I would hurt myself. Balance is not my forte. I get very concerned about, to my fellow commissioner's point, of creating patchworks for anything. I think we should be very explicit in that scooters have a 6 mile/hour speed limit. If you're going faster than that, there could be enforcement. And I'm really hoping that if we're increasing the speed limit to 15, people will feel more comfortable on the streets. I have a lot of friends who ride them, and that's their comment usually, is that they don't go fast enough. I ride bikes a lot. I actually get very worried about any sort of sidewalk restrictions to an extent because I ride Capital Bike Share a lot, and a lot of Capital Bike Share stations are on sidewalks. And you enter a street through a curb cut or something to that extent. And if we're starting to restrict the use, is it within 20 feet of a curb cut? Is it here? Is it there? And I also really am concerned about the petitions that could happen if we create an opportunity to restrict them on sidewalks, because it could be just a downhill spiral of requests for prohibitions on sidewalks that gets very political at the end of the day. I think the speed limit, the requirement of speedometers is very important. I think we should be treating them like we treat Capital Bike Share, like we treat any of our other shared mobility platforms that aren't shared literal cars, and that rules should be equally applied across all of these micromobilities, and that we shouldn't be saying scooters X, e-bikes this, but that this is our regulation for shared mobility. That includes your personal bike to the extent that we can regulate that, but really not creating out parse levels of you can ride on a 25 mile/hour street, but you can't on a 35, because sometimes your trip's gonna take you there. And that's gonna happen, and maybe we want some people who are comfortable on the street, we want some people who aren't on the sidewalk. Let's create speed limits and rules that apply, but not specific to different types of streets, because people don't know what an arterial is. And half the time, if you're a pedestrian, you don't know what the speed limit of the street you're on is anyway.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. First off, I agree. We really need to be treating these things as consistently as humanly possible. And by that, I mean e-bikes and acoustic bikes and e-scooters and acoustic scooters and the whole kit and caboodle. To that end, I would say there should not be a speed limit on these things on roads other than the posted speed limit on the road. And that, in many ways, will help with the 35 mile an hour arterial question. You know, if that scooter can go a bit more than 15, they're going to have a much happier time on that 35 mile an hour road. But if we're not going to limit human-powered bicycles, I don't think we should be limiting e-scooters on road. I think there should absolutely be a speed limit on our trails, but it shouldn't care whether you have an e-assist or not. I think 15 is probably too low. I think 20 is probably where we want to be. But really what we're talking about here is like we care about reckless behavior, you know, and there are times on the trail where you can go 20 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour, and you're not going to bother anybody at all because there's nobody there to bother. And there are times when you shouldn't be going more than 8 because there are, you know, dogs on leashes and strollers and that sort of thing. And like a speed limit is too blunt an instrument to regulate the behavior that we're trying to regulate. And I would be much happier if we were heading in the direction of a, you know, the equivalent of a reckless driving ticket that was available to anybody on a a personal mobility device that you can, because, you know, you heard what the police are saying. Like, they're not going to be out there gunning people for going 7 miles an hour. They want something that they can ticket somebody when they cause a crash, when they run into a pedestrian. And you can do that with a reckless, you know, piloting of your personal mobility device ticket just as easily as you can, or maybe more easily than you can like you were going 7 miles an hour, not 6 miles an hour on the sidewalk. Let me just say one thing. I have like one more thing here and then we'll bop into that. I just want to echo everybody else, like, no late night restrictions. That is the most insane, ridiculous thing we could possibly be doing here. Like, no metro service at night. People have to have a way to get home. Our bus service at night is not great. People need a way to get home. And if somebody is drunk and is making a bad decision to pilot themselves home in some way, I would far rather they do it on a scooter or a bicycle than that they get into their personal car or a Cartigo. So if we're not turning Cartigos off in the middle of the night to prevent drunk driving, then we sure as heck shouldn't be shutting e-scooters off in the middle of the night to prevent drunk driving. Commissioner Land, tell me.
Yeah, the whole recklessness standard, I think, is a good one to do. Out west, on the highways, a number of states used to have no speed limits in rural areas. They had a reasonable and prudent was the law. There has to be a body of law out there that defines what it means, because they were given out tickets and people did get fined because they were not driving reasonably and prudent. We could use that presumably as some sort of guidance to create language that would be enforceable and would stand up.
In those conversations with police, they're always looking for a tighter definition because it makes the enforcement easier. But
They want a bright line.
right?
I get that.
I also, just for clarification, I think you guys may already know this, but on the speed limits, the state code, as it regulates the for-hire industry, imposes a maximum of 20 miles per hour by electric motor on a level surface.
Yeah, well, so we're hamstrung by that.
Commissioner Price.
I actually just want to say just one last thing on this particular topic. Jim, you've come to us and you've been in charge. You've been sort of the face of the shared mobility, micromobility device for the county for like the longest time. I just want to say thank you. You have created, I mean, this is yeoman's work. Something from absolutely nothing. So to create this, I think is a great start. And I don't think county staff hear that enough. So thank you. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you.
I'd like to echo that. For all my criticisms here, this is a good thing. We need to do it by January 1st, so let's do it. We can definitely make it better, but it's pretty good so far. I want to make it clear that I'm coming from the critical to make it even better rather than critical because I don't like it and don't want to do it.
We appreciate the statements of support and the good ideas that you've brought us tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the reason why we need to hear your feedback is there is not complete consensus among staff and policymakers, elected and appointed. So your advice and direction actually means a lot in that internal debate that we've been having, as well as the other commissions and committees that we've been going. It's been very valuable.
But it's important that, I mean, if there are county board members watching, and there probably are, they need to know, if they're watching, that this is fantastic work. Everything, of course, can be improved. That's there's no perfect piece of art, but this is a great start, and it can only get better.
Taylor, can you pronounce your last name for me so I can get it right in the future?
It's Rich.
Rich, thank you. Commissioner Rich.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi again.
I'd like to certainly echo the idea that this is, in general, very excellent, and I'm very excited to be seeing it. I have a couple of quick thoughts. First, about signage for areas where scooters or bikes may be prohibited on sidewalks. I'd love to see those, and I'm not sure if this is part of the ordinance or not, but not as physical signs coming out of the sidewalk that may be taking space away from pedestrians, but as something perhaps painted on the sidewalk itself. I very much agree with Commissioner Slatt regarding speed limits, and that I don't think that there's any compelling reason to restrict small vehicles any more than we restrict large ones on streets that they are sharing. Particularly vehicles that are private or are human-powered and don't have any kind of automatic limits. I know you didn't ask about this specifically, but I am sort of curious about the fees at the per vehicle level, as opposed to having a flat fee, say, for a set number of vehicles. I think that charging companies on the basis of the number of vehicles that they use is a disincentive for them to provide more vehicles, which I think is something that we want. I think we want more of these vehicles. And I understand that we want to bring revenue from these companies so that we can use it for staff time and for infrastructure and so on, and I think that's very important. But I don't think that the infrastructure costs are necessarily linear with the number of vehicles that are being used. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I mean, on that last point, we did want to have it so the per vehicle thought is that it is proportional. A big company pays a lot more than a small company because they're putting more vehicles out there. So, but you had a sort of different take on that, is where you kind of have ranges, I guess, and those fees based upon the ranges, and that might be a way to do it. I think we're kind of like the per vehicle basis, but that's an interesting concept too. Yeah.
Sure. I think I would envision it maybe as tied to the cap as opposed to the number of active vehicles.
Okay, thanks.
Other commissioner comments? Okay, well, I'm writing up some stuff, so we can sit here in silence, or if somebody else has something they've been thinking about saying, they can go ahead. Commissioner, yep, gone right back out of my head again. I'm sorry. Okay. 2 new commissioners, this is too many for me to keep in my head.
This sort of echoes a few points that were made. This whole discussion is kind of ironic considering the fact that we don't limit the speed that vehicles can travel apart from what they self-regulate. I mean, that was poo-pooed almost 100 years ago by automakers. So the fact that we're even talking about this is sort of ironic. But I do have one real question. I know that some of the scooters have lights at night. Do they all have lights at night, and for the e-bikes as well?
They do.
Okay.
They all have headlights, and they all have at least a reflector on the rear. Some of them have a light on the rear, and I think we'd like to see lights as part of the standard equipment.
Thank you.
Commissioner Calkins.
I apologize. I have one final question. DC is currently reconsidering their regs and going to create a 4 system for 4 winners for the district, basically, for scooters, and 4 winners for e-bikes. With that change, is Arlington considering increasing the cap if, say, the other scooter providers who don't want to continue operating in our region. Is there a complete cap on the number of scooters or e-bikes that a specific operator can operate, or is that something that they can negotiate with the county depending upon their needs?
So we don't have a cap specified today, and I'm not sure that we would be imposing one until some time when we feel it's needed. But
That was my question.
Yeah.
Commissioner Price.
Quick, I actually just thought about it. A quick question regarding jurisdictional agreements. Do we have one? I know we have one for car to go, so I can from point A to point B. If I grab a car to go here in Arlington, I could take it across into Washington, and then vice versa. Are we going to have that kind of agreement set up with the District of Columbia, or is it destinations are only internal to Arlington?
You want to answer?
Yeah, they're internal, but we have also been, and I wasn't going to go into detail, other jurisdictions are struggling with the same things we are. Speed limit, jump was not deployed here, so if they came over here, jump was fining them on e-bikes. Now they're permitted to come in. City of Alexandria is considering this very subject, the 6 mile an hour, 15 mile an hour. We were trying to align as much as we could consistent with our neighboring jurisdictions. For example, I think Alexandria right now is proposing 15, but we've heard from you tonight on that subject. And they were going to do 6, but now I understand they may not have any restriction on the sidewalk. That doesn't mean we should or shouldn't, but just we're trying to align ourselves with all those.
Speed aside, I'm really actually talking about the free movement of the vehicle between jurisdictions. In other words, could I travel from Arlington to Alexandria, or can I travel from Arlington to DC and then take that scooter back? Is there a reciprocal relationship that we have, a reciprocating relationship that we would have with the jurisdictions, like car to go? Is that in the thought? Is that
Right now, you can under the pilot. I think only 11% of the trips left Arlington County or originated from outside of Arlington County. So I think that would be envisioned that they would still be able to operate as long as the provider has the permission to operate in that jurisdiction. If they don't, the geofencing will kick in and it slows to a stop.
Gotcha.
Because the
Thank you.
geofencing ultimately controls
you.
the
Gotcha.
borders of where they are.
Understood.
So if you're on a brand that is permitted to operate here but not on the other side of the bridge,
cut out.
similarly, the geofencing that's enforced around Arlington National Cemetery and Fort Myers, you can't operate there because it'll shut down on you. It won't let you park it there either.
Yes. Thank you.
I have a question you may not be able to answer, but I need to ask. Need more lawyers in the room. That's something nobody ever said. How does this impact our partners who own and operate trails in Arlington County? How does this interact with the regulations that Nova Parks puts on the WNOD? How does it interact with the regulations that the National Park Service puts on the Mount Vernon Trail?
It should work well because both of those agencies have recently changed their regulations to allow micromobility devices to use them. And neither of them really has an imposed speed limit, which is kind of where we still want to be. And so I think it harmonizes things more when we take action to allow the uses of our trails.
Great. All right. Here's what I'm thinking for a structure is that we will start with the county manager's recommendation as the kind of basis of our motion. I personally would like to add a few amendments to express support or lack of support for some of these questions to make it very clear to the board where we are coming down on some of these questions, assuming that we recommend that they advertise the ordinance in the first place. So just so everybody kind of knows what I'm thinking structure-wise. So to start that off with the initial motion, I move that the Transportation Commission recommend that the county board authorize the county manager to accept the findings of the shared mobility device demonstration project evaluation as memorialized in the report dated September 2019, and authorize advertisement of a public hearing at the November 16th, 2019 county board meeting to consider revisions to section 14.2 of the Arlington County Code to address the use of micromobility devices, including motorized scooters and power-assisted bicycles, and authorize issuance of regulating permits for the public rental of such devices. The amendment, if it approved, would also implement a permit fee structure for micromobility services for hire.
I'll second.
Okay, so that's the motion before us. So that I don't monopolize this whole thing, would somebody else prefer to offer an amendment to that motion, or should I go ahead? Okay, seeing nobody jump in, I would move to amend the motion to state also that the Transportation Commission does not support nighttime restrictions for to express to the county board that the Transportation Commission does not support nighttime restrictions for micromobility devices. That's seconded. Is there any discussion of that amendment? All those in favor of the amendment? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? Abstaining? Okay, 6-1. 6-0-1, thank you. And that is nighttime. I would like to offer an additional motion to amend, expressing that the Transportation Commission does not support banning micromobility devices from 30+ mile per hour arterial roads.
Second.
That's seconded. Is there any discussion of that? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? Abstaining. All right. 6-0-1. 30+ mile per hour arterials. All right. I would move that to amend the motion to also express to the county board the Transportation Commission does not support speed limits for micromobility devices on street or in bike lanes.
Second.
There's a second for that. Any discussion of that? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Also abstaining, Commissioner?
Opposed.
Opposed. All right. 6-1. Do not support speed limits on street or in bike lanes. I only got one more here. I move that we amend the motion to express to the county board that the Transportation Commission supports moving away from sidewalk speed limits and towards prohibiting/penalizing reckless driving of micromobility devices to manage conflict on sidewalks.
I'll support that. Second that.
That's seconded. Is there discussion of that? All right, all those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4. Opposed? 3. That barely carries. All right. Any other motions to amend? Commissioner Calkins.
That the Transportation Commission does not support creating sidewalk-specific bans of scooters.
Second.
That's seconded.
What's the motion again? Restate the motion, please.
The Transportation Commission does not support the creation of sidewalk-specific bans.
This is for micromobility devices.
Yes.
Any discussion of that? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Commissioner Clement?
Opposed.
Opposed. 6-1. Any other amendments? Commissioner?
I'd like to move.
Commissioner Lantalvi?
I'd like to move that the motion be amended to require a more full definition of e-assisted wheeled micro devices that would be consistent with the Virginia code.
I'll second that.
And to speak to it, this is going back to what I talked about earlier. There are way more devices now that are out on our streets than just scooters, bicycles, and hoverboards.
Can can I get staff's reaction to that? Do you feel that the ordinance as currently stated already encompasses all of the various things because of how they're defined in the state code or anything like that?
If you look at section 112 definitions, there's a reference to and similar devices that conform with the Code of Virginia definition standards. So that was where the county's attorney's office tried to cover all the definitions. It's in the 1, 2, 3,
Okay, so
4,
it
5,
then will
6.
be consistent with the Virginia code no matter how it, okay, then I'll withdraw the motion.
Okay.
Commissioner Calkins.
I would like to amend the motion to specify that the Transportation Commission would like a geographical definition defined for the Route 1 corridors and the Rosalind-Ballston corridors in some form.
Supports providing a geographical definition of the Route 1 and Rosalind-Ballston corridor. I'll second that. Any discussion of that? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7-0. Any more amendments?
Sorry, one more.
All right, so the motion as amended is
Oh, I have one more.
Oh, Commissioner Calkins, in at the buzzer.
That the Transportation Commission recommends that the equity percentage be increased from 15 to 20% outside the RB and Route 1 corridors.
I'll second that.
All right, it's seconded, so it's on the floor. Do you have any specific reasoning, data, experience that says 15% is too low, but 20% is about right?
I did the math. I think 20% is probably too low, but I also understand that these are businesses, and I think 20% is better than 15. I think it should be something more like 30% or a max or a specific number that need to be located outside of, but without knowing what these caps are and the fact that we don't, that we just want to encourage more than 15, because if you have 100, that only means 15 is located outside of the RB corridor and Route 1 corridors.
Are we discussing this?
Yes, this
Okay,
is the
if-
part where we
if-
discuss this amendment.
Sorry.
I like the idea. I think if we start at 15, I think we can get high. I think within a year, if we see it's not sufficient, they can go higher. I don't know if it's necessary at this stage. I think, like I said, I think what they put together was pretty good, and it's a great start. So I think there's time to study this and to determine if we need to get to 20, if we need to go to 25. So I'm probably going to vote no.
I, too, plan to vote against this motion to amend. I am all in favor of equity and distribution, but in the absence of specific data that says that 20% is better than 15, I'm not interested in disagreeing with staff on this without more particular reasoning. Commissioner Lynn, tell me.
And there's nothing that says they can't on their own put more out there. Correct. So this would just be a floor.
Right.
Okay.
It's a start.
I see staff shuffling through papers. Does staff have a thought on this
maybe
amendment?
you guys, because you just read this more recently than I did. I was trying to remember what the current percentage is, and I think it's about 1%. Is that right, or less than 5%?
I think we've been getting a higher percent outside the corridors more recently because we've been talking to the companies and they're starting to respond to us a little more. But I personally are seeing more of them in my neighborhood, which is outside the RB corridor, but I don't have an exact number.
Right. I was just trying to baseline existing to the extent that we could, even though it's a flawed number.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other discussion of this motion to amend? All right, all those in favor, just since it's been a while we actually talked about it, all those in favor of amending the motion to express that the commission supports changing the equity percentage of devices located outside of the corridors from 15% to 20%. All those in favor of that motion to amend, raise your hands. That's 1, 2. All those opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Abstain.
And abstain, 2, 4, 1. So that motion fails. That does not become part of our motion that is on the floor. Any other amendments to the motion as amended? All right, so just to restate one more time, it is essentially the county manager's recommendation, which you can read in front of you on the piece of paper in the board report, amended to express that the Transportation Commission does not support nighttime restrictions on mobility devices, does not support banning micromobility devices from arterial roads with a 30+ mile per hour speed limit. Wow, my handwriting got real bad as we got farther into this. Does not support speed limits on road or in bike lanes, and that the commission supports moving in the direction of away from speed limits on sidewalks and in the direction of a reckless driving charge for micromobility devices. The commission does not support sidewalk bans for micromobility devices, and that the commission does support providing geographic definition. That's what that, like, wow, I didn't put the final line on the bottom of my E. Does support providing a geographic definition of the Route 1 and RB corridors in the ordinance. All those in favor of that motion as amended, raise your hands, please. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed? Opposed. 6-1 is the final vote on the motion. Thank you so much to staff who have done a ton of work on this, and for everybody here who doesn't care about scooters who sat through all of that. The commission will take a brief 5-minute break while we get set up for the next item on the agenda.
Mr. Chairman, this is the reason why I come to church. This. So we can do this. This.
Standing up and going like this, like he's carrying stuff, you know. I know you were.
All right, I think we can get started as everybody
Okay,
shuffles
our
back in.
next item is item number 5, the Verizon site plan. This is also known as 411th Street South. This is an action item, and the applicant will give an overview.
Good evening. I'm Dan Van Pelt with Grove Slade. I'm going to talk to you about the transportation aspects of the project, 411th Street, also known as the Verizon site. I think you're all probably pretty familiar with the site's location. It's at the intersection of 12th and South Eads Street on the western edge of Crystal City on the border with Pentagon City. The Elcor's Altair project, which in this image is under construction, is now constructed. It's just to the north. And then Penn Place, Amazon HQ2, second phase of that is just to the opposite side of Eads Street there to the west. So the site today exists of a vehicle storage lot for Verizon and a surface parking lot. Access to the site is from Eads Street via 11th Street. So the site is pretty heavily constrained. The image here on the right goes through a lot of the constraints. It's a kind of a narrow site, but as you walk around it, starting at 12th Street, and as we were planning the site and thinking about how you would have access to the site, there's a future transit way along 12th. And then the proximity of any sort of curb cut on 12th and its spacing over to Eads and 12th really did make that desirable for access. Bike lane in the county project will be upgrading the facilities along Eads Street. Doesn't really make Eads Street a great place for vehicular access, along with the utility easement that runs along there, and that's the purple that you see here. So really site access was limited to coming in off of 11th Street, which is a narrow street, but that's suitable for access. There's also utility easement there that you have to cross over to get in there. One of the other remaining site access constraints is the existing Verizon building, which is there on the east side of the site, shown there in gray, and that's going to remain. So the site plan was developed, includes 306 residential dwelling units, 10,745 square feet of ground floor retail space, and then there'll be below grade parking. So just to talk about the street sections for a moment, this shows 12th Street on the south side of the project. Really no changes with this project to the cartway. The changes will occur the northern part of the curb line, which is onto the right of the image there. So improving the sidewalk and the landscaping adjacent to the site. Moving around the corner to Eads Street, the project there is on the left side of the section. We've been coordinating with staff. What this shows here is the future county project for South Eads Street, which would move the bike lanes to the outside of the cartway, and they'd be buffered by parking lanes. And then you'd have a travel lane in each direction with a turn lane. And so then up against the site, there'd be a 10-foot sidewalk up against the building. Moving around to the north side of the site to 11th Street, this section here shows the Altairs on the left-hand side there, so you're seeing that building section and the parking garage. The new building is on the right-hand side, and the parking would go under the sidewalk. And then the cartway for 11th Street is one travel lane in each direction. So from a transportation standpoint, the site is very well situated, lots of transportation amenities, gets a high walk score. You are about 7-minute walk from Pentagon Metro Station, a little bit further to Crystal City Metro Station, 16 bus routes, well-connected bike and ped network that's going to be further enhanced by this project and other projects that are happening in the vicinity. A little bit more on the transit. There are 9 bus stops within a quarter mile of the site. Again, 16 bus routes, Metro bus routes, Metro Way, ART, Fairfax County, Loudoun County, OmniRide are all near the site. And so that's why there's a lot of color on the figure there that's on the right side of the image there on the slide. Again, Pentagon City and Crystal City. Pentagon City is the nearest blue and yellow line Metro service. Well-connected pedestrian network. You have a lot of, in addition to the Metro and transit, you've got a lot of other walkable destinations nearby. excuse me, you have a lot of other, you have such as the Whole Foods is across the street, Fashion Center Mall, Harris Teeter's not that far away. And I think with future developments that are going to happen in the neighborhood, you'll have additional retail that'll be part of those projects. In our review, most of the sidewalks near the site met ADA standards and county requirements, but again, will be improved around the site with the improvements that will happen on the site. There are bike lanes on Hayes, South Eads, 15th Street, Crystal Drive. There are signed routes on Army, Navy, Fern, and 15th Street. There's a Capital Bike Share Station that is located just to the east of the site on 12th Street. There are proposed improvements along Army, Navy Drive for cyclists. There'll be the bike lanes along, buffered bike lanes along South Eads. We looked a little bit at those, that future section in the section drawing earlier. And then we know that there's improvements that are currently being considered for, as you continue down South Eads along the Met Park project. Shared lanes along 12th Street and cycle track is also proposed along Clark Street over in Crystal City. So switching to the parking ratio, the residential off-street parking guidelines for multifamily residential projects, I was part of the working group for this, so I'm very pleased to see that we've got a ratio that is pretty much in line with that. If you look at the image on the right, it shows the location of the site it's at a 0.4. We're proposing a 0.43 ratio for the residential parking. That meets a requirement of 122 spaces, and we're pretty close to that at 133 spaces for the residential. So accessing that parking and the loading also is from the parking entrance that comes off of 11th Street. So you circulate around South Eads and then enter the site from 11th, come into the driveway and go down into the parking. Again, 133 spaces for the residential. There's also 10 visitor spaces, and there's also 5 spaces that are provided for Verizon. That's a replacement for them so that they have some spaces that they require. This shows the parking plan, one full level on G1 and on G2, and G3 is just a partial level. Pedestrian circulation, the southern half of the site, shown here in a pinkish color, is retail, and that's where we anticipate pedestrians on foot would enter into the retail portions of the project. The northern half there, which is in a bluish color, is in the red arrows are the places where we anticipate people on foot would enter the residential lobby. There is bike parking at the ground level, long-term bike parking in the ground level for retail, and long-term bike parking down in the garage for residential. And so that you both come in through the driveway off 11th Street to access that parking. We have a total of 123 residential bike spaces, and there's 18 long-term retail spaces. Those retail spaces are the yellow that are shown here on the left slide, on a left image on this slide. Those are on the ground level. Also, just to point out on that slide are the short-term bike spaces. Those are shown in green, and so those have been situated on both the north and south sides of the project. When you get down to the G1 level, that's where the long-term residential bike spaces begin, and there's 41 of those on the G1 level, continuing down into the garage. The G2 and G3 levels also have 41 long-term residential bike spaces. The loading circulation, you can access again off of 11th Street and come into the driveway. There are the 3 loading berths here. Then there's one also provided for Verizon. This plan is different than what we showed you when we came to you as an info item. There's one additional berth has been added. We're now meeting county requirements and the accommodate 40-foot trucks. There's a multimodal transportation assessment that was conducted for this project at 8 intersections were studied. Because of the low parking ratio and the size of the project, the number of vehicular trips was relatively low. We didn't find any mitigations being triggered by the capacity analysis. The mitigations for this project really are through the enhanced site design elements and the transportation management plan. And so I'll finish here with the transportation management plan, here are the elements of it. Happy to discuss any of those with you, and certainly happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Does county staff have a presentation?
Good evening. My name is Joanne Gabor, and I am with DES. I'm here to discuss the Verizon site plan. The applicant provided a very thorough presentation about a lot of the transportation elements, so I'm going to focus a little more on some of the basics, if you will, of the project and skip over the transportation elements that were just discussed. This is actually a major site plan amendment to number 244. I think we all are aware of this location. It's next to Linux Club, the Altair, and then across from Penn Place. So the existing development does have the surface parking lot and the Verizon telecommunications facility building. The original site plan, number 244, was approved in September of 1986, and this did permit construction of the Verizon building and then a future phase of residential development, which obviously was not completed. The proposal does propose to rezone the site from RH 3.2 to CO Crystal City. In terms of the building, the applicant showed you a rendering of it, and it is 19 stories, 306 units, about 11,000 square feet of retail, again with the 148 parking spaces in the 3 levels below grade. The total site area is just under an acre. There is a vacation of portion of Old South Eads, with a total of 260,000 square feet of GFA, which translates to 6.57 FAR. They are at a 200-foot building height, and the GLUP is high office apartment hotel. The only modifications that are being requested are the aforementioned residential parking ratio at 0.43, and they are providing the 0.05 ratio for visitor spaces for the first 200 per the residential guidelines, and also the minimum type handicap spaces based on the number of type A units. They're also asking for density exclusions, about 3,800 square feet, and this is for below-grade mechanical and utility rooms, and above-grade air shafts for interior ventilation of the units. A couple areas that, just to illuminate you on, is there is a county-owned land, the teardrop parcel, it's shown in the green. Again, it's not necessarily a transportation issue, but it's something that has been discussed in association with this project. There is a little area in orange. It's a little sliver right here that this is where the vacation is. And Linda Collier is here as well to speak about the vacation if you have any questions. It is approximately 469 square feet. And then as mentioned, the existing Verizon building, which is in this location, is to remain. On the streets, I think the one thing that I did want to mention is just the clear sidewalks. I believe the applicant did mention the travel lanes and provide that information. On 11th Street, right now, we're proposing a 6-foot clear sidewalk. On 12th Street, we have an 8-foot clear sidewalk. And then the western walkway, which parallels the building, is a 6-foot clear sidewalk. On South Eads Street, which actually is not along the project frontage, there is a county project that goes from Army Navy Drive to 12th Street south on the eastern side, so adjacent to the teardrop parcel. This is going to consist of restriping Eads and then providing the buffered bike lane and an upgraded streetscape. If you've been out there today, it's this sort of sad asphalt path, and this will provide street trees and some area for street lights, and then a 6-foot concrete sidewalk, as well as a buffered bike lane. The parking, I think, again, this was covered fairly well, but again, it's basically 0.43 ratio. We have the 3 loading docks, and we do have the bicycle parking, and they all meet the minimums required per the standards. And in conclusion, staff does support this project. It recommends approval with the conditions as shown in the county board report, and if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Commissioner Lantalmy, you look like you have a question.
I have one. The vacation, is that's part of it before us too? The South Eads Street portion on the MTP, is that part of this? ordinance of vacation for Old South Eads running north to south along the northern part of the western boundary? Or is this something?
This is a portion of Old South Eads Street they've requested a small sliver be vacated.
Are they buying that from the county for the
Yes.
project? Why is it still on the MTP? Because it's not been a street for a long, long time.
I don't think Old South Eads Street is on the MTP, but I am not positive.
It's
But
not. If it were still on the MTP, it would be very difficult for us to say that vacating the street would be in accordance with the MTP.
Because
So
it's saying
there is a portion, Old South Eads Street, I mean, there is South Eads Street, but then there's also Old South Eads Street.
that's what I'm talking about, Old South Eads.
It was my understanding that it was no longer on the MTP.
Because it's saying vacate a portion of the right-of-way for Old South Eads Street on this that we're going to be voting on. That's the county recommendation, so that implies that there is a right-of-way.
Yes,
Well, there's,
the right-of-way continues
Still
to
county
exist.
owned.
It's
yes,
still owned,
the right-of-way
county-owned
still
right-of-way.
exists.
Okay, but it's not on the MTP.
All these vacations have to come to us so that we can double-check and say, yes, it's okay to vacate this because we're not going to turn around and try and turn it into a street 5 years.
But it's not on the MTP then at this point?
Correct. It's not an active street at this point, I don't.
Okay. I
But-
just wanted to make clear
But
what I'm
but it
looking
is
to do here.
still technically county right-of-way.
Okay.
As Linda did mention, I'm looking it up right now, but it is not, there's actually not a street there today.
Right, I know.
So let me just check if there's maybe another question, I'll have that answer quickly for
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Other commission questions? How many, so you have two sections of long-term bicycle parking, one for residential and one for retail. How many bicycle parking spaces are in the residential long-term? Approximately, I don't have to have an exact number.
That's 123.
That's, I think, includes the residential, doesn't it?
Yes, 123 for the residential.
But how many for the retail?
Oh, for the retail, 18.
18, awesome, thank you. That's like, my understanding is that's way above like the minimum that's actually required by the site plan conditions, is that correct?
To be honest, I would need to look. I know it meets the minimum,
I'm
but
pretty
I don't
sure-
remember if it exceeds the minimum. I feel like it does.
I'm pretty sure our minimum for retail is like one long-term space for every 25,000 square feet of retail, and you have less than 25,000 square feet of retail. So I think you're like 17 over the minimum, which is awesome. Thank you. Other commission questions? Commissioner Linton.
And more so that there's no retail parking for cars on this site. If I'm that correct on that? Thank you. I'm very pleased with that.
If I may, to answer Commissioner Lantelmi's question, I did just check, and it is not shown on the MTP currently.
Any other commission questions? All right, then I'm just going to make a couple of comments. One, this is a great project on a very constrained site, so bravo, because all of the circulation in this thing was hard. Two, thank you for coming in with a reasonable parking ratio in a metro corridor and not like 0.8 or something crazy for something that has that many transit lines on the map. I really appreciate the easy to get to long-term bike parking. That kind of convenience really matters to people and makes a big difference. Those are my comments. Anybody else? Commissioner Raddick.
I just noticed that I think the one bike share station has moved. The one that was on 12th it's now adjacent to the Whole Foods, I believe, as opposed to on 12th adjacent to Route 1's viaduct.
That's correct. It's been moved on, it's on the western side of Eads, just south of 12th Street in front of Whole Foods.
Anybody else? Then I move that the Transportation Commission recommend that the county board adopt the ordinance for an amendment to SP number 244 for a new 306-unit multifamily residential building with approximately 11,428 square feet of retail, et cetera, and adopt the attached ordinance to rezone from RAH 3.2 to CO Crystal City as required to actually implement this thing, as outlined in our board report dated September 27th, 2019, and also that the Transportation Commission, thank you, recommend that the county board enact the attached ordinance of vacation to vacate a portion of the right-of-way for Old South Eid Street running north-south along the perimeter, along the northern portion of the western boundary of B, 411th Street South condominium with conditions, and that the Transportation Commission finds that the vacation of a portion of the right-of-way for Old South Eads running north to south, et cetera, is substantially in accord with the adopted comprehensive plan, specifically the Master Transportation Plan of Arlington County, Virginia.
So, second.
And there's a second. Is there any discussion on that? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's unanimous. Thank you very much.
The next item is item number 6. This is 1900 Crystal Drive site plan. This is a site plan info item. I'll turn it over to the applicant.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. My name is Kedrick Whitmore. I'm with Venable, and I represent the applicant, JBG Smith. The item before you this evening is an information item for a site plan amendment and rezoning at 1900 Crystal Drive. To let you know where we are in terms of status, we've had our LRPC meeting related to the block plan, and we'll now be moving into the SPRC. So we appreciate the opportunity to come before you this evening and get your feedback. So the site on the next slide you'll see is really in the heart of the Crystal City and National Landing area there outlined in red. And on the next slide, you can see a little more detail of the existing conditions here. As you can see, it's bounded by Richmond Highway, 20th Street, Crystal Drive, and 18th Street. One thing that you cannot see from this photograph is that where the building is shown as 1900 Crystal Drive has actually been demolished and brought down to grade. And the two buildings that we are talking about this evening will be located on the footprint of that previously existing building. A couple other, sorry if you mind jumping back, a couple other things to note. There are a few internal things going on this block. It's an extremely large block, which is kind of hard to tell from this photograph, but it does really drive a lot of the design involved in this project. As you can see, there is a plaza area here in the middle of the site. And what you can't tell from this photograph is that there's a pretty significant grade change from Crystal Drive to this plaza area. And so as a result, it is accessible only through the office building lobbies at 1801 South Bell and 1901 South Bell, and formerly 1900 Crystal Drive. So if you'll move to the next slide, this gives you an idea of the existing conditions, and it really helps to show some of that grade differential, particularly the photograph in the upper right. You can see the difference in grade from where that delivery van is and then the kind of floor above it. That really is the level of grade difference we're talking about here. What you can also see is some of the scope and scale of these blocks, just how darn big they are, as well as how really unfriendly they are in a lot of ways to pedestrian and even vehicular traffic. If you move to the next slide, this is a section looking north through the block that really shows you that level of grade change. As you go up from Crystal Drive, you'll see this is where the demolished 1900 Crystal Drive building was, and you move up from that 37-foot elevation up to 53 to the plaza level. So really like a story and a half difference between the plaza level and Crystal Drive. So that I'd like you to keep that in mind as we go through this project, because it really does drive a lot of the design decisions that were made in putting this together. So if we move to the next slide, This is our building program. As I mentioned, there will be 2 buildings replacing the previously existing Crystal Drive, both residential, totaling 790 units, approximately 773,000 square feet of residential density and about 40,000 square feet of retail density. So the next slide gives you kind of a rendering. We're not talking about architecture, but I think it's very helpful to see not only how nice these buildings look, but how they relate to the street as compared to their predecessors. So this is looking north on Crystal Drive. On the next slide, you'll see the retail and pedestrian environment that we're hoping to create down here around Crystal Drive. This is the southern tower. And then if you move to the next slide, you'll see this is part of the northern tower, also showing that pedestrian retail environment. And what you can also see here is the beginnings of, on the left side, as you move in between the buildings, the pedestrian priority area that we're creating. That's going to be a really important element in breaking up this block and enhancing the permeability of this area. So if you move to the next slide, this is our site plan. As I mentioned, there's this pedestrian priority area that runs off of Crystal Drive and bifurcates the 2 towers. It runs between them and moves out toward that central green area. It intersects with another new transportation area that we're proposing, and that's a north-south retail alley. There will be retail on the backside of these buildings, but it also allows for a lot of the vehicular and transportation issues to be moved inboard of the site so that things like loading, that sort of thing, don't impact the exterior streets. What you can also see is that plaza area that I mentioned earlier is all in green. That is going to be the subject of a post-approval process, and there will be an easement granted over that open space. That is the first phase of Center Park, which is a real centerpiece of the Crystal City sector plan. I mentioned earlier there is a grade differential between Crystal Drive and that plaza area. The way that we have proposed to deal with that differential is through a monumental stair, and that is the white area there, showing that as you move up to the T of that intersection with the alley and the pedestrian priority area, that you would then be able to take the stairs up to that plaza area. So if you move to the next slide, this gives you a little more information about how this area is going to operate. You can see that, again, all the loading is off of that retail alley. The residential entrances to the towers will be off that plaza street as well. We're hoping that's going to help drive pedestrian activity as it draws the residents down through that plaza street. Again, I'll reiterate that the open space and park area is a level above this, that all of this is happening at that 37 or so grade, and then you move up to that 53 for the park area. It's in the grade out area, but it's a little bit higher elevation than what we see here. So if you move to the next slide, little more information about how we're going to use these areas on these internal streets. So what I've been calling the pedestrian priority area, also called a curbless Woonerf, that is going to be a curbless environment. The idea is that cars will be allowed here, but that it will be made very clear through a number of design elements that I'll show you in a moment that the pedestrian is the priority, that the pedestrian is king here, and that cars will be kind of secondary. Similarly, we will have a curbless environment on that retail alley as we move from the outside. And then as we move interior to the site, that will actually become a pedestrian tabletop where the Woonerf and the curb and the retail alley meet in order to really enhance that the pedestrian accessibility there. So on the next slide, you'll see a little more information about how we anticipate circulation here. That pedestrian priority street or Woonerf off of Crystal Drive would be a one-way only, allowing that vehicular traffic only into the site, not out of the site. We don't intend for this to be some kind of a cut-through or anything like that, but we do think it's important to get your Ubers, your delivery trucks, off of Crystal Drive. That street is already very difficult in terms of curbside management, and so we believe that getting those kind of delivery and rideshare vehicles off of Crystal Drive is important, and that this is the best way to do it. Unlike the Woonerf area, that retail alley will be two-way to allow circulation through the block and the loading and services that I mentioned previously. If you'll move to the next slide. This is something we're very excited about. The fact that those building functions like loading are on the outside of the alley, it allows us to be able to close down a pretty large portion of this to vehicular traffic for special events, farmers markets, things like that, and create a great synergy with the new open space while still maintaining the ability to load the buildings effectively. So the next slide little more information. I mentioned that we're going to work very hard to make this a pedestrian priority area, and here are a few of the ways we're going to do it, and that is with our landscaping, with our furniture, with our curbless environment, and the materials that are going to be used here. So this is the section of that pedestrian area. And then on the next slide, you'll see what we're proposing to do with the alley. Similar, we don't have obviously the street trees and the furniture there, but similarly, we're going to have a curbless environment that caters to the pedestrian here. On the next couple of slides, a few of the street sections. I won't dwell too long on these, but here's the Crystal Drive section looking north. The next slide is the 20th Street section, and then after that, the 18th Street section. Certainly, if there are any questions, we can take a look at those. Moving forward, giving you an overview of the transportation in the area. This is a very walkable area. It's a short walk to the existing metro station, and we'll be very close to the new metro entrance in Crystal City. We also have great accessibility to regional rail and bus routes, as well as the pedestrian and bicycle network. The next slide has a little more information on the distances to those transit facilities and what services are offered. The next slide gives you some more information about the accessibility, not only to these other modes of transportation, but the Mount Vernon Trail and a lot of great retail amenities, more and more springing up all the time in this area. And as I mentioned earlier, the new development is really going to help out that pedestrian environment overall. Similarly, bicycle facilities, there are existing bike lanes that serve the site, as well as a future cycle track and nearby Capital Bike Share stations. So the next slide, we'll discuss parking. I'll take just a minute on this because I think it's important. Like many blocks in Crystal City, the entirety of this block is served by a single garage underneath the whole block. As part of our proposal, we're going to be demolishing a portion of this garage and rebuilding it underneath the two buildings that are being constructed. And in doing so, we're going to reduce the number of parking spaces on the block. Currently, there are 1,820 spaces. We're going to reduce that number to 1,673. And as I mentioned, we're going to improve the location of the parking entries and loading. We've provided the parking ratios for the entire block here as we see them resulting following this reduction in the number of parking spaces. So the next slide gives you a little bit of an idea of what we'll be doing. You can see the existing garage in the top three slides, and then the changes that we're going to be making in the bottom slides. And then the next slide is our MMTA. We studied 13 intersections. Based on that study, there was one mitigation required, and that was the signal timing adjustment at Clark and 20th Street as the only item that popped up. So finally, the next slide will provide you our TDM information. This is the standard suite that you're accustomed to seeing with site plan projects in Arlington County. So with that, I appreciate your time, and we'll be available for any questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Clement.
Yes, well, the plan looks very impressive, but I noticed that your parking ratio is substantially higher than the site plan we just approved. But I understand that's because the parking already exists there. And obviously you can't, well, you are removing some of it, but you can't remove all of it, and there may not be a need to. So is that the explanation for your ratio?
You're on.
Yeah, yes, exactly. We're actually net removing parking spaces on the site. The site was just built with so much excess parking that all we're really doing is demolishing the existing set of the garage, resetting the foundations, and you've got to kind of fill that void back. And so we're filling back with garage as we go up. And you'll see the reductions on the ratios for the rest of the building, the office building, the hotels are actually reducing as well. So while it's higher than more recent projects, it's just the nature of the fact that we're repurposing a significant amount of parking on site.
Thank you. I have one follow-on question. The area that from which the parking is being removed, what will that be utilized for?
That's the new cores for both towers will drop into those spaces. So the elevators that are dropping down into the garage, the new garage is significantly less efficient, that portion, because of two towers landing opposed to before where there was one elevator core for the existing office building.
Commissioner Calkins, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, it was. So I have a follow-up question about the garage. If you feel that it has excess parking, are you designing it in such a way that that space could be reused at a certain point if that parking is not utilized?
So the The short answer is no, because under the building, you'll see in the plans, it really becomes, there's very little efficient parking that is being left there in the new build. The old set of the parking of the existing structure that is standing there, it's pretty antiquated, late 60s garage, and at this point, there's not much to do with it.
So there's not like in a future it can be used for like pickup, drop off, or delivery or things like that. Okay. My second question is not garage related. It is related to the Wunderf. Can we bring up the cross section for that? Yeah, perfect. And it's hard to read on this. What is the actual clear distance between the physical poles that will be kind of those natural delineators for where cars really can't go?
The area that they can go or they can't go?
Like basically, what's the cartway?
It's 12 feet, 8 inches.
So, and it's one way?
Yes.
Have you guys, it's a little wide, a car can kind of go fast on that. Have you guys thought about pulling in that natural barrier a little bit? What's the widest delivery truck you think you might have down that and make it semi-uncomfortable for them to drive and design around that?
Yeah, we could definitely look at that.
If you want it to be pedestrian dominated, make it so that the car has to feel like they have to slow down, because almost 13 feet is comfortable to not slow down in.
Makes a lot of sense.
Commissioner Lantelmi.
Well, I'm very excited about the Wunderf from the Festival Street, the new circulation through here. This is great that we're actually going to be putting them here in Arlington, and I'd love to see how they end up actually working. And I suspect they will be pretty successful. So kudos to doing it. Who will actually own these streets? Will they be county owned? Will they be an easement? Will they be private streets?
So they're over structure, so they'll be privately owned with an easement to the county.
Okay, good. I also noticed that the Crystal City Underground looks like it has a branch that goes right to where the monumental stairs are going to go. Are you planning to have, and also as part of the stairs, an entrance to the Crystal Underground there? Do you want to go back?
So, yeah, that one. We'll get there. The short answer is yes, there will be a way to connect from that G1 level, which is where the underground is, out directly onto that retail alley and the monumental stairs.
It'll be, and it won't be this convoluted, weird, going up through an alley, through different steps and everything, and through 5 different doors, or is it going to be pretty obvious and open? The reason I'm saying that is that will contribute to the pedestrians.
Yes. It should be pretty obvious. So if you'll see where it says outbound access to parking garage, that grayed out area that is, or whited out area above it, which is where the monumental stair lands. The idea is to have connectivity, because you can actually take advantage of the grade change there and go into G1, which is where the underground is, but then also have the monumental stairs go up. We've kept that out of this design process because it's supposed to be part of the post-process approval to make sure it integrates with Center Park. And so we're continuing to work with staff on how that actually gets designed. But the idea is to have the connectivity there.
Is the access of the underground there with the Wunderf, or is it off to the side somewhere?
So it should be kind of right on that corner where, if you go, yeah, right.
Where the existing underground corridor is?
The main underground corridor that connects to the metro is actually much further.
The east-west corridor.
Yeah, that's sort of down. There is a connection of the corridor that really connects the two current office cores that are there. It's pretty underutilized because it's mainly just used by the office tenants, but it loops around and connects back to the main underground space that's more under the Marriott and the 1800.
Okay, because I sort of go back and forth in my mind whether it should be on the axis of the entrance should be on the axis of the Plaza Street, or is the priority of the stairs to go up to the park? You know, that's a hard design choice for me, but it should be thought through pretty well.
Rob, were you motioning that you had something to add?
I did have a couple things to add after the presentation, but I can let you guys keep talking. But
usually on the info items, you're all like, "No, I'm just here to answer questions." All right,
there's a couple things. So as we're looking at this, the daylighting of the alley is a very elegant solution to some problems that this site had previously. So we're looking at how that can be really a true shared space, supporting garage access, loading, the retail and pedestrian connectivity. But staff is a little bit more concerned about the Woonorf idea mid-block. Between the two buildings, we're much more supportive of a standard plaza pedestrian design. The introduction of the new left turns that are coming off of Crystal Drive to enter mid-block would add a level of operational challenge. But we're going to continue to talk about this through the SPRC process. There's also a few changes in the area that we just wanted to make sure you understood. 18th Street, when the MTP bike element was updated, was changed from a standard on-street design to a desire for a protected facility. So we're going to be looking at how you can, rather than having the original cross-section approved in the Crystal City plan, if there's a way to, within the section that was recently approved for the block north, achieve a protected east-west connection. So we'll be talking about that through the process. It may be that we are confirming that it's possible to be done, and the county will do it in a coordinated fashion, as opposed to just what this project is adding to the network one piece at a time. But we'll continue to talk about that. We're also going to try to look at how to increase or enhance the facilities on Crystal Drive, particularly the southbound facilities in this area. Crystal Drive is kind of notorious right now for its double parking in the bike lane. So we want to try to reevaluate that and see if we can bring a better solution forward, or at least discuss a better solution with this plan. And so I think those are some of the major transportation elements that we're going to continue to look at through the SPRC process. And October 29th is our first SPRC meeting for this project. So I invite you to identify a commissioner and come and participate in the process.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Any other commissioner questions or comments? Commissioner Price.
Thank you, staff. Thank you for this presentation. To the applicant, it's a very good project. I think I applaud you for your design. As a pedestrian, I appreciate the fact that you want to make pedestrians a priority, at least along the plaza and your retail alley. I appreciate that. But I have a question to get to the beautiful green area. If I'm a pedestrian, I'm coming down Crystal Drive, I'm going to walk down the plaza, I can go up this grand set of stairs to get, is it up or down? I forget, going up. But if I'm, how do I say this, physically challenged, or I'm a senior and I can't navigate those stairs, what are my options to enjoy this beautiful greenery?
So I think there's two options. We've left room for potentially an elevator that would take the grade change up and potentially even connect down into the garage levels to give accessibility through all three levels. Alternative, there are ways in which the monumental stair can be designed to allow that type of mobility access as well.
Okay.
We've looked at multiple different design options, but that is going to be part. Our understanding is the preference is to have that as part of the post-approval process.
Thank you.
Commissioner Calkins.
Commissioner Price asked one of my questions, which was, how are the stairs integrating a ramp? Personally, I err on the side of ramp than on the side of elevators, as elevators break occasionally. My second question was prompted by the fact that you mentioned left turns into the Woonorf, and for some reason in my head, I just assumed it was going to be right turn only. From safety concerns, I would echo staff's concern about left turns into that and really encourage you to think about making it right turn only.
I know at LRPC there was some question about the 20th Street cross-section and whether it met the sector plan and all of that. Has that been figured out? And is there a slide of what the 20th Street cross-section is?
So there's a slide with the 20th Street cross-section. The has it been figured out is I think a bigger picture question, because if you look at this diagram, you kind of see how 20th Street has some necks and changes in there. There's a bunch of buildings in places. So we've asked the applicant to go back and sharpen their pencil as they're looking at particularly the block to the south, so that we can ensure that we have a center line that is going through, and then a cross-section that is delivered over phases in a manner that we want. And so we'll be able to talk more about that as this advances, but I think there's a little more work to do.
Great. I don't know if you can go back to that transit slide. I know there's Metro Way going northbound on Crystal Drive. Is there transit that goes southbound on Crystal Drive in front of this site? And more specifically, are there bus stops on the street frontage of Crystal Drive on this site?
No.
Cool. All right. That was my guess as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, just northbound.
Awesome. Thank you. And then for Mr. Gibson, 18th Street is like the biggest question mark in my mind. Like, there was an approved cross-section with the development to the north. There's the whole Crystal City second entrance question. Like, is the county planning to do a capital project? Is the county asking JBG to be reconstructing 18th as part of one of these projects? Is this all still up in the air about how 18th Street gets redone?
I'm pretty sure that it gets redone with the new curb for each of these projects. So to the north, they are pushing the curb alignment north. And then this is establishing a more uniform curb line. And so that in phases will set the street cross-section that then can be programmed and hopefully with those protected lanes.
Great. Then I just wanted to opine on a couple things. One, I'm very happy that staff is talking about that 18th Street cross-section. I have never been wild about the fact that we approved bog standard painted bike lanes for 18th Street right next to what is going to be the second entrance for the Crystal City Metro Station. I think we've seen it all of our metro stations. There's a huge amount of pickup and drop-off activity that happens there, and when given the opportunity, that will happen in the bike lane. So I think protection is extremely important on 18th. I also am glad to see staff is talking about Crystal Drive and how that bike lane can function better going forward, because we've certainly seen that given the opportunity, any heavily retail oriented street will result in parking in the bike lane. So I really would love to see this project come back with some protection on those bike lanes to prevent that incursion and make this a happier place to bike, to improve access from the Mount Vernon Trail, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely would not support left turns off of Crystal Drive into the Woodruff. I am skeptical still of car access to the Woodruff at all. Just the fact that we would have cars crossing the sidewalk on Crystal Drive gives me pause. I may be able to be convinced of that. We know pickup and drop off or something, we probably want to get off of Crystal Drive, and this is certainly an opportunity to do that. I'm really glad that it's proposed as one way. I think that's far more likely to be workable than two-way. But definitely left turns into the Woodruff is, I think, an extremely bad idea. Where is your long-term bicycle parking located in the proposal?
It's down in the G2, the G1 level. Or it's technically G2, but the first level under the building.
The first level parking under this building.
Correct. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, these buildings. The G1 level technically exists under the park and the other parts of the block.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I know it's very tempting to put it there because you have all this extra space in the garage that you don't know what to do with. But we're seeing more and more buildings with street level bicycle room access. I think it's a very strongly desired amenity, and really just makes it so much easier for some place like Crystal City that has good bike access to help people get in and out, rather than having to figure out if they're putting their bike in an elevator or they're riding down the garage ramp. And if they're riding down the garage ramp, is there like an arm that has to go up, and how do they get around that, and just all of that rigmarole. Anything else? Commissioner Reddick.
My wife and I used to live at 220 20th Street, and we wanted this building knocked down for as long as we've seen it. So I wanted to say thank you for finally knocking it down. And I don't think I'm alone in Crystal City when I say that. So this is a very exciting project. I do have a question about, I guess it's between the 18th and 20th Street connections that where the loading dock in the middle, the arrows seem to imply that it's one way in the middle, where they'd have to maybe cede to each other. I don't know if we can pull that. I don't know what slide it was. Because it sounded like that's a two-way street as opposed to the one off Crystal Drive, which would be one. Because it seems like there's not room for two arrows. I don't know if that's just.
I think that's a graphical error there. And I think that one of the things, if you go back one slide, by grouping the garage and loading entrances in the manner that they have, that middle section can be closed off to vehicular traffic during events. So all the buildings will continue to function and have access to either 18th or 20th. And you could have a connection from the grander open space at the 53 level down through this area and the plaza or Woonerf to create a larger event or public space.
But just to clarify, most of the time, a car could completely traverse the north-south alley in either direction.
Yes.
Cool. Commissioner Rich?
Thank you. I think I'd like to build on the same topic and perhaps encourage you to consider making it so that the arrows in the previous slide will actually reflect reality, so that someone wishing to make a delivery, say, to the South Tower, would pull into the alleyway, have to deliver to the South Tower, and then pull back out onto 20th Street, rather than being able to go all the way north to 18th Street, having some sort of do not enter sign as you come out of the South Tower garage entrance area. I think that would cut down on a lot of, people just trying to use this as a cut through to avoid having to go on Crystal Drive, which might make the pedestrian connection down the stairs toward the plaza a little more dangerous. I also like to build on Chairman Slatt's question about the long-term bicycle parking, and encourage you to consider finding a place for that on the actual G1 level in the area under the plaza, I guess, the Central Park, just to avoid that grade shift as cyclists take their bikes in.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, we will see you at site plan review and back here in some number of months. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The next item is item number 7, South Queen Street. This is an RTA, request to advertise, and we do have one speaker for this item.
Second. Okay. Thank you for having me here again. This is the request to advertise for an amendment to the Master Transportation Plan for adding a new section of South Queen Street. This actually was a topic that came up a little over a year ago. We, at that time, decided to defer action on it, and I will go through the history of it since many of the commissioners weren't part of the group at that time. So the proposal is to add a small section of South Queen Street onto what is an existing street. That's down in the Forest Hills neighborhood. This action really is only to add that section of public street, and it is being done so that the adjacent property, which has a proposal for development process, would have a legal street in which to have building frontages on. And so all we're doing at this point is talking about the street, not about the development at this point. So let me move ahead. Just to give you an idea, this South Queen Street kind of comes down through this Forest Hills neighborhood of townhomes, ends currently in a kind of cul-de-sac with a little turnaround. But off of that, there is an existing right-of-way, a 40-foot wide right-of-way that was put in the same time this area was first developed in the late 60s, early 70s. And that area has not been developed at any point. That little section of street is not constructed as a street currently. It leads to the end of a property. The property that is marked with the blue star there is now a proposal for a residential subdivision, and they're seeking use of that 40-foot right-of-way. That is not currently shown in the county's MTP. It hadn't really been picked up from the time we did the map for this plan. So here's sort of the background. Last year, this developer came to the county with a subdivision proposal. It's different from what they're proposing today, but essentially they were asking for ability to change the MTP to add this section of South Queen Street so that they can have street frontage, similar to what they're asking for now. But we deferred that because at the time they had not submitted an approvable subdivision plat. They have returned. They have submitted a plat. It has gone through the review process in DES. And there are still some issues, I think, to be worked out with it, but I think it's largely one that the county staff would be ready to move forward on. The new lots that are proposed would require having a street extended into the property that I have with the blue X on earlier, a blue star on earlier, and they would be dedicating a section of about 100 feet of new South Queen Street, which would be constructed by the developer with their development. And so, moving along. So we are currently finishing up the review of the subdivision plat. The next steps would involve plans being submitted, civil engineering plans being submitted, further review by our zoning office, looking at subdivision, looking at stormwater, looking at other civil engineering standards to figure out if a development is acceptable in that area. So all new street and other kinds of utility improvements would be put in by the developer at that time. They would be dedicated as public street, and then they would be taken over by the county for future maintenance. So just kind of going over a little bit of the public engagement that's taking place. County staff has met with the Forest Hills Homeowners Association in the past. That was last year. There's been conversations with the Arlington Ridge Civic Association president, also took place last year, so a lot of this gone through. More recently, the developer, as part of the subdivision process, has had to put letters of intent out to the adjacent property owners and to the Civic Association and the Homeowners Association so that they're aware of what is going on with this development proposal. We are now at a request to advertise stage, so we will have to come back, go through the whole process of amending the Master Transportation Plan. Would involve a public hearing, Transportation Commission next month, Planning Commission also in their meeting, which would be November 4th, and the County Board would have approval November 16th. So that's a summary of the report. Any questions? And I think we have one speaker.
We do have one speaker. Awesome.
You could go back to the map that shows the property. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. For the record, I'm William B. Lawson, Jr. I represent the contract purchaser of that property. When they first got that under contract, we're surrounded by townhouses, garden apartments, and a school. To the north is single-family houses. So we thought that perhaps an upzoning would be in the cards, and the client was willing to do some affordable housing. We met with the townhouse community, and they did not like that idea at all. And at that time, we hadn't even filed anything. We just had a conceptual plan that we had shared with the townhouse community and with Mr. Duffy with the planning department. So the county manager informed us that he thought that this should be put off until we had a plan that had been filed and had been far enough along that we knew it was approvable. So we went ahead and changed our the goal that we had, and we're now doing 5 single-family houses. It'll be a by right subdivision. We are doing a tree survey, and we're going to try to preserve some of the trees that are on this site. The subdivision, we think the preliminary is about to come out, approved, and then we file our final plans and so forth. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Commissioner Clement.
Yes, so the plans have changed substantially since a year ago?
Yeah, we didn't. All we had was a conceptual plan a year ago. Right now, we have 5 single-family lots.
All right, now, the neighbors, the Forest Hill Civic Association specifically, they were vociferous in their opposition a year ago. Has that opposition changed?
Well, they told us if we did single-family houses, look, I don't speak for other people. I've learned not to do that. But when we met with them before, they said, do single-family houses and we'll be content.
Okay, thank you. That's the information I wanted.
Yeah.
Any other commission questions? Commissioner Lantelme.
This is, I'm not sure whether staff or Mr. Lawson would answer this. Given this is a by right, given that it's a landlocked piece of property, legally can it even be denied? Under Virginia law, is there a right to have access to a public right-of-way?
I don't know what a judge would do. When the townhouse site plan was approved, you can see that a road was brought to our property. And the intent was that the road would continue, because there's not a turnaround or anything, that the road would continue into our property, at which point there'd be a turnaround. Whether the county would be obligated, I really don't know.
Will the houses there, given the shape of this lot, they will have private, once it gets past the property line, the street will be a private street reaching those 5 properties?
No, it'll be a public street.
So you're going to be dedicating the portion of the street on the property to the county?
Yes, sir.
And that's required in the by right?
It's a by right subdivision. We're doing a hammerhead rather than a cul-de-sac. I actually have the plan if you'd like to see it.
I'm just trying to figure, yet I don't need to see that. I was just wondering, because there was at one point, there was a proposal that you could build a single-family house on it, and we'd have to allow you to have the access to it if you built just one house on that lot, which could be done by right. And there would be a private driveway, which would go to the public right-of-way, to the property line within. So that's what came up a year ago in one of the discussions. But the owner decided to go a different direction, obviously. So I'm still wondering how much of this is by right and how much it requires county approval, that it's not, if it's by right, there's no discretion in the county. It has to be done. And I'm not sure what our role is if it's by right that we can't deny it.
I don't know if the county could legally deny it or not. I'm not sure that where the road stubs, dead ends, that's enough frontage even to do one house. What is that, 40 feet? So it might be, you might be able to do one single single-family house.
You can.
The only other way you could get access would be to bring a road through one of the two existing homes. But, again, the whole intent was to allow the road to continue into this property, at which point there'd be a turnaround.
Right, but so the county, even though it's not on the MTP, the county owns that right of way?
Correct. The portion that is unbuilt is county right-of-way, just like the rest of South Queen Street.
Are there already utilities under it, I think? I've walked the site.
I don't believe there is any utilities in that area right now.
Because I seem to recall maybe a manhole, there's a stormwater facility going through it right now. It's
Possibly, but
the piece of property that's in question is very, very steep. It's heavily wooded, very steep. There's definitely going to be stormwater issues coming out of it that'll have to be addressed. Again, I'm not sure how that works with the permitting process.
Right. It will have a lot of challenges to develop. Our purpose tonight really isn't to go through the development of that piece of property. It's really more a matter of should the MTP be amended to allow this street to continue such that it could provide access into that adjacent property.
And this is just an RTA, so a decision's not. Is staff recommending it be done, or is it just RTA so we can then discuss and the county board can then?
Yes, we're recommending the RTA take place. I don't think we've taken a position on the street extension precisely. Really, what we'd like to do is just move the process forward one more step.
Commissioner Calkins.
I have a transportation-related question. How would what is now a cul-de-sac function like if the street were to be extended? Is that green in the middle actually built? So would it be a roundabout?
It would be something like a roundabout in the middle of this street.
I actually think before we authorize a change to the MTP, we would need to know how that change to the MTP would function, or is that not necessary? Basically, if we extend the street, is it creating an unsafe situation for the current configuration? Like, can we design a safe street?
I understand what you're asking about. Cars do drive around that grass circle today. I would imagine that they could do so even coming from this other direction as well.
If I could say one more thing, I've been following a lot of conversation at the county board meetings dealing with the trees and the loss of trees. And so that's why my client volunteered to go ahead and do a tree preservation plan. Technically we don't have to do it, but in order to provide a benefit to the county, so to speak, in return for allowing the road to extend, my client wants to do a tree preservation plan.
Commissioner Clement.
Well, that's very welcome news. You should know that your client is more forward-thinking than APS right now on that very subject.
We've been involved at Westover too.
So yeah, personally, see no reason not to move the process forward. And when we get there, we need more housing in the county. So plenty of other lots of single-family homes have public streets that support just those single-family homes and not anything else. It's not anything that we haven't done in the county before. But perhaps there will be additional things to consider when we get down to the actual action. But in the meantime, does anybody have any other questions or comments on the RTA? All right, then I move that the Transportation Commission recommend to the county board that they authorize advertisement of public hearings to be held at the November 4th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting and the November 16th, 2019 County Board meeting to consider an amendment to the MTP to remove a portion. Nope, that's not it. That's the next one.
That's the other one.
Same dates to consider an amendment to the Master Transportation Plan to add a section of South Queen Street south of the 2400 block.
Second.
That's seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If anyone cares, it's 1-0 Dodgers.
And the next item is item number 8. This is the removal. 27th Street South, this is tied to Jenny Dean Park expansion. This is an RTA request to advertise. This would remove a section of 27th Street South. Currently, it goes from South Nelson Street to Shirlington Road. This would be the western section, basically west of the WIDA facility, the studio, to South Nelson Street. And we have a whole team working on this of both DES and Parks. We have Scott McPartland, Diana Probus, and Rich Viola. So with that, we've had 2 recent planning studies that were adopted by the county board last year. The first one was the 4-mile run area plan, and the second one was the Jenny Dean Park master plan. And really to expand the park, 27th Street really has to be removed. The park will be, the first phase will be under construction very early next year. And the county has been acquiring various parcels on both 27th Street and 4-mile run drive for the past, I believe, almost 20 years. I'm getting a nod, so. So this is the sort of the Phase 1 park improvements, and you would see sort of west of WIDA. This is a section that would be removed. So with that, we also have an ultimate, the final park improvements, giving a sort of a plan view. And with that, you would be seeing next month the actual the MTP amendment would be going to Planning Commission and to the County Board. And again, to facilitate the Phase 1 park expansion in early 2020. And that concludes it.
All right, thank you very much. Are there any commission questions? Great, the commission definitely supported the 4-mile run plan, the Jenny Dean plan. This is necessary in order to implement it. It was a good idea then, it's a good idea now. I move that the Transportation Commission recommend that the County Board advertise public hearings to be held at the November 4th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting and the November 16th, 2019 County Board meeting to consider an amendment to the Master Transportation Plan map to remove a portion of 27th Street South from South Nelson Street to the west boundary line of the WETA property. Seconded. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That is unanimous. And I would like to state, this was not placed last on the agenda just to keep park staff out late.
Oh, I thought it was. Just joking.
More comp time.
And our last item of the evening is other business. I want to emphasize that our next meeting is on Wednesday, October 30th, and it was done this so you could all have Halloween off on a Thursday.
Yay. I want to also state, I don't know if you've noticed on RL Now or in the news, but there's a lot of development coming down the pike. In Arlington, which means there are a lot of site plan review projects that are going to be needing staffing real soon. So if that is something you are potentially interested in, please come talk to me so I know to try and offer it to you, tap you for it when those come in. Often site plan review starts between our meetings. Like, we don't know that site plan review is starting at this meeting, but then it ends up starting before next meeting. So I can't always say, hey, this project is starting site plan review, like in a meeting, and offer it to people. It's very helpful if I know ahead of time that people are open to that. So contact me offline. You all have my email address, or, just chat with me after the meeting. Anything else for the good of the order? We are adjourned.
Great, thank you.
Before 11.
Very well done.
I saved it on my OneDrive. In case I'm interested. Glad you're aboard.
Hope you enjoyed your first meeting. Yeah.